Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all the participants of this 2 days international webinar on United by Pens, Divided by Fence, Perspectives on Partition Literature. Today, we shall carry on the legacy that we had formed yesterday through the presentation of Dr. Niaz Zaman, the advisor for the Department of English and Modern Languages, Independent University, Bangladesh. And therefore, we are going to witness today another sets of presentations which will be presented by our renowned resource persons like Professor Himadri Lahiri, Professor Roshni Sengupta, and Dr. Gautam Karmakar. Few months back, or perhaps a year, we would not have contemplated on organizing any international webinar through our college. However, it is the present pandemic caused by COVID-19 which has created the situation wherein we have been partitioned not only through physical borders across countries, but also we have been partitioned through our own relationships, through our own social distancing. But this has also created a different kind of medium for us to shift from the real to the virtual world. And it is through this medium, it is through this platform that we have tried to restore and to regain the experiences of partition. And this time would not have been a better time to discuss about partition which had affected all all sections of people across the world, and we definitely hope to bring a substantial change in the society, in the world, through our academic discussion, through our way of academic and cultural exchange through this international webinar. Therefore, I would like to request all the participants who are joining us here through StreamYard and through YouTube to be actively participant of this 3 days international webinar on United by Pens, Divided by Fence, Perspectives on Partition Literature. Today, we are very much privileged to have with us as resource persons Dr. Gautam Karmakar, the Assistant Professor of the Department of English, Barabazar Bikram Tudu Memorial College, Sidho Kanho Birsa University, who shall be deliberating on the topic Partition and Border, Screening the Tension in Popular Bollywood Movies. We shall also be witnessing the deliberations of Dr. Roshni Sengupta, Assistant Professor in the Institute of Middle and Far East, Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, who shall be deliberating on the topic Desolate Daughters, a feminist reading of partition films. And we shall also be hearing from the very renowned senior professor, Professor Himadri Lahiri, former professor in the Department of English, Burdwan University, who will be deliberating on the topic Partition Studies, Recent Trends. And therefore, I would like to request you all to now welcome our first resource person to this podium, who shall be deliberating at length about partition as it has been manifested and represented in celluloid in Bollywood movies. Before I hand over the mic to Dr. Karmakar, I would like to introduce our resource person for today. Dr. Karmakar is an assistant professor of English at Barabazar Bikram Tudu Memorial College, Sidho Kanho Bisha University, West Bengal, India. He has completed his PhD from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, National Institute of Technology, Durgapur. His essays, research papers, book reviews, and poems have been published in many reputed international journals. He has taken interviews of many notable Indian poets writing in English. Apart from organizing one international conference in India and many such others, he has presented papers in many international conferences in India, Germany, England, Slovenia, and other European countries. He has edited four critical books on Indian poetry in English. He seeks interest in Indian writings in English, South Asian literature, film studies, Marxism and post Marxism, eco critical studies, Dalit literature, and cultural studies. May I now call upon Dr. Gautam Karmakar, one of the most renowned young academician who has been able to create a niche for himself in the world of academia and publishing world to present his deliberation. Right up to you, sir. Could you please unmute yourself before you present? Dr. Gautam Karmakar, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible and you may continue.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
Patriot,
Yes, sir.
you are not visible here. Will I start?
Yes, sir, please do. The chat box says that you are very much audible and visible to all our participants. To you, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay. Okay, will I start? Okay, okay, okay. So, thanks, Patriot, for your warm welcome and for the introduction. And I want to thank Dr. Surajit Sen, the organizer, and the whole team working behind this virtual platform for putting together this 3-day international webinar entitled United by Themes, Divided by Friends, Perspectives on Partition Literature. And I must say that the title itself says so much. It symbolizes all the nuances of the partition. And it is beautiful webinar conducted by the Department of English, Netaji Subhas Vishwavidalaya. It is in Tripura. So thanks for the warm invitation and at the same time introducing me with your students, guests, and all the other academicians who are viewing it from all the corners of the world. And the guidance that you are all providing during this severely distress testing time is praiseworthy. So although uh, the title of my talk, that is partition and border screening the tension in popular Bollywood movies, demands so many theoretical and cultural interventions. But due to time constraint, I will try to limit myself within certain nuances of partition and the reeling of it by mainstream Bollywood industry. So you can take this talk as a kind of review where I will try to name a few Bollywood movies and at the same time the storyline to make you understand how the real is real. So before going to do that, let me share my screen, my PPT. So it's about partition and border screening the tension in popular Bollywood movies. And before going to talk about partition and the Bollywood movies, I have divided this talk strong and focused. So at first I will tell you the historical background of partition, and after that visual concepts of partition, and the differences or the fundamental aspect of partition can be clearly understood by us all. So regarding the historical partition, it was dated August 1947 that for the party was put into action, and it was finalized by July 18, 1947, and was at the fourth one, and later India was formed, and all the regions and Pakistan was formed along with the Muslim regions, and Pakistan was formed into two dominations. It is the East Pakistan and then the West Pakistan, which were separated geographically by India. And the partition of India begins in August 15, 1947, and August 14, 1947 into Pakistan. So India was separated on the day of independence due to the tension. Tension will tension between the Hindus and the Muslims. Muhammad Ali led Muslim League claimed that India consists of two separate nations, that is Hindus and Muslims. China had even despair of the state minority communities. China united and began to argue that mainstream parties such as the Congress were insensitive to Muslims. At the same time, know that the condition in which Lord Mountbatten presented the plan on the 3rd June of 97, and it offered a key to the political and constitutional gain by the refusal of the Muslim League to join the Constituent Assembly. And as a result, Mountbatten's retained a kind of unity in the country would be partitioned, but so would Punjab, so Nepal, and so the limited partition would meet both the Congress and the League's position to some extent. And this kind of ceremony for the transfer was held on 14th August 1947 in Karachi and 15th August 1947 in Delhi. And two it came to existence as at the stroke of midnight on 15th August 1947. And so the plain motives uh, nothing by Sikhs, Muslims, and Hindus in Punjab and Bengal, assemblies would meet and vote for partition. And if a simple majority of either
Sir,
group wanted partition, then this protest would
I'm so
divide.
sorry to
And
interrupt you.
since
Not
India
this
was to
time.
take its own decision, India would be independent by August 15, 1947. The separate independence idea was crucial for it. And to be set up in case of partition. And as an aftermath of partition, what a partition has offered to us, it's the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965, War of 1965, left devastated, and riots erupted and looting broke out widespread, and women were raped and battered both by the Hindus and the Muslims, and trains full of battered women and children would arrive between the borders of India and Pakistan only. And as you can see in the first slide, that there I'm seeing that Mahatma Gandhi with Lord Mountbatten and Lady Mountbatten in 1947. There's the Mountbatten, and then that treaty is going on, and that's the newspaper of that very day when and later in my another slide, that here I'm showing that it's about the visual chronicles of partition. You can take the slides. It's a presentation about verbal visual. If you have novel and picture partition, you can see that I have about the plane, people that going on. So this is the condition of the given time. the partition is what type of condition and what scenario it hosted us, and the 50 million refugees were forced into regions completely new to them, the province of Bengal and Punjab, and it was divided, causing
This is an ardent request to all the participants to please stay tuned to the presentation of Dr. Gautam Karmakar. The source at our resource persons network connectivity is not stable, because of which we are not having uninterrupted transmission. Please bear with us. Dr. Karmakar,
It's raining here.
could you please,
so. Am I audible
yes,
now?
you are audible, sir. Could you please switch your network connectivity once again so that we may have a smooth transmission?
Hello, am I audible
Yes,
now?
sir, you are audible, sir.
Okay, okay. So I'm getting the notification that that the audio is not clear. Now it is clear.
It is
No,
clear,
still
sir.
I'm getting it.
Perhaps the network transmission is not stable out there.
Okay, 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 okay,
Please continue,
okay,
sir.
okay. Um, so that what I was telling that the partition of India left India and Pakistan devastated, and riots erupted, and looting broke out widespread, and women were raped and battered by both the Hindus and the Muslims, and trains full of battered women and children would arrive between the borders of Pakistan and of India, Delhi. So this was the kind of condition, and that time voice still breaking. The network connectivity of the resource person is not stable, because of which we are facing this technical issue. Okay, it's okay now. Okay, okay. Thanks a lot. Yes, yes, yes. Perhaps there's a kind of technical glitches on my part, and I'm extremely sorry for that. Please bear with me. So you can see this kind of images, and at the same time that over 15 million refugees were forced into regions completely new to them, and the two countries are still arguing over the landlocked region of Kashmir. Many believe that the partition not only broke the unity of India, but it also took away the sense of belonging to many people who were torn apart by the native region. So the partition of India in 1947 is a kind of seismic event, and after gaining independence uh, from say, from centuries of British colonial rule, India as a region of myriad languages and religions, the biggest being Islam and Hinduism, were separated under the pretext of of easing religious tensions, and a massive exodus began with Indian Muslims heading west to the newly created Pakistan, and the Indian Hindus heading in the opposite direction. All sides lost ancestral lands, roots, and possessions, but the greatest tragedy was the bloodletting that took place throughout that kind of population exchange. Now it is okay. Constantly get messages that this kind of that I am not audible and I'm not visible also.
You are audible, sir. Please continue.
It's clear now. You can write there. And what I can say that partisan triggered riots and mass casualties and a colossal wave of migration. Millions of people moved to what they hoped would be safer territory, and with Muslims heading towards Pakistan and Hindus and Sikhs in the direction of India. And as many as 14 of 16 million people may have been eventually displaced, and they're traveling on foot, in bullock carts, and by train. And estimates of the death toll post partition range from 20,000 to 2 million approx, and many were killed by members of other communities and sometimes of their own families, as well as by the contagious diseases which swept through refugee camps. And at the same time, women were often targeted as symbols of community honor, and with up to mm, 1 lakh women raped or abducted. And what can explain the intensity of that violent reaction? It's a kind of that many of the people concerned were very deeply attached, not just to maintain law and order, and especially were sexually interested in terms of proper weapons and demobilize soldiers were done that. And while the incorporation of experiences lead to the general agreement that the partition uprooted and displaced approximately 12 million people, and that massive wave of communal rights across the subcontinent lead to an unparalleled scale of violence and at the same time atrocity. So you can see that mm, this kind of, under this kind of era, that the novels and the films were made, and to some extent life remains affected long after that dust has settled, and the sense of loss and the threat of violence and the disorientation started again, and it lingered on. And after the 70 or 80 years on, that cinema, which continues to act as a powerful lens through which certain nuances of partition or the effects of partition on ordinary people were reflected. And partition as a subject in Indian cinema took up around that early 1970s, and with a surge in output in the 1990s here. So some kind of thought-provoking works are there which capture the experience and aftermath of the major historical event, and which helps us to understand the complex relationship that exists between partition and between India. So now I'm assuming that the UG and PG students and the research scholars are my main target audience for this talk. And so this first part will be some kind of literature review where I want to make you all aware of that certain canonical text on partition which need to read and reread to understand the fundamental basics of partition. So basically, in the this slide, I want to tell you the name of the novels on partition. Okay, okay, it's fine. Okay, thanks. So sorry for the technical glitches. Extremely sorry. Due to the heavy rainfall here, Raiganj, the mm, network connection is extremely poor. Before going to tell you something about some kind of text that I have come across during my study of partition narratives, this partition narratives was an episode for the enormous intensity that affected the normal lives of of people, and it is at the same time it is also human emotions and values to such a great extent that all creative writers and artists have come under its influence. And the men of letters choose partition of India and its impacts on various people and society as a theme for their script. And not only writers but painters and film producers and serial producers have also explored this occasion in their um, own way, and in their own relative terms. And so the literature which depict the most human cost of the independence and partition of India consist of magnitude of works, and so many works are there. Among them, the notable works or the notable novels that deal with partition can be named as Raja Rao's Kanthapura, Arkanarayan's Waiting for Mahatma, Kamala Markanda's some Inner Fury, Mukesh Keswan's Looking Through the Glass, Khushbant Singh's Train to Pakistan, Visham Sahani's Tamas, then Manohar Malgaokar's A Bent in the Ganges, and Distant Drum, Baptist Siddha's Ice Candyman, and Chaman Nahal's Azadi, Amitabh Ghosh, The Shadow Lines, Balchandra Rajan's The Dark Dancer, Atiya Hossain's Sunlight on a Broken Column, Manju Kapoor's Difficult Daughters, Khaja Ahmed Abbas Inkilab, Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, and same. So these are the books where the traumas of partition to some extent are explored. Now, let me tell you about the books that I have come across during the study of partition, and uh, and in order to explicate the nuances or the trauma or the wounded history and traumatized memory of partition, we need to read some of this canonical text, and upon its premises, the we can understand or we can explicate partition in a vivid way. So now now let me go to the first of the books, that Silence of Partition, Border Trauma and Partition History by Jennifer Hewson, in which she shows how in The Color of Violence, that is written by Kakar Sudhir, where Sudhir Kakar asserts that the partition violence is commonly agreed to have been the momentous event in the shaping of Hindu-Muslim relations in independent India. And it's a true fact that one cannot talk about the culture, politics, and identity in South Asia without drawing upon the partition that and for that you need to read some kind of canonical text. And at the same time, I will tell all of you to go through the text of Jill Lidu's unsettling partition, which also reinterprets the silences found in women, accounts of sectarian violence that accompanied partition as a sign of their inability to find a language to articulate their experiences without invoking the metaphors of purity and pollution. And at the same time, you can go through that text of Pandey's G. Pandey's Remembering Partition, where Ganendra Pandey's book begins with a definition of two versions, that the two kind of history, the partition history in 1947, whereas the historians and the history seem to what partition amounted to us, and it was. And how the partition was before, and in the main a new constitutional or some kind of political arrangement which didn't deeply affect the central structures of Indian society. So it's a kind of history where he asks the other side of history, and that can be written, and if it is written, it how should it be written? And similar questions have been asked by some several recent commentators on extraordinary violence that accompanied the withdrawal of British colonial from the Indian subcontinent and the creation of the two nations of India and Pakistan. And next, we can go through Subhir Kaul's edited volume, that is the partitions of memory, and Sukesi Kamra's Bearing Witness, to name only a few that help to unfold the partition as multi-dimensional history and movingly argument the experience of the You can see the slides. I have only a few slides. I have nothing to show in the slides, only to show the cover of the book, so that you can understand that these are the books which we all need to go through to understand the nuances of partition. And Sukeshi Karma tried to show the turn of some kind of literary representation and criticism in the collection of survivor testimony that has addressed memory and especially memory of the past and the influence of the present as a kind of crucial factor in beginning to understand the meaning of partition history in those who actually live through the momentous separation and continue to live in the stories they hear and the memories the haunt their working and sleeping hours. You can also go through a wonderful book edited by Professor Amritjit Singh, Professor Nalini Ayar, and Professor Rahul K. Gairola about the revisiting India's partition that explored the impact of the long partition, a concept developed by uh, Wazira Zamindar to underscore the ongoing effect of the 1947 partition upon South Asian nations. And here to some extent, both Professor Singh and IR and Gairola not only extended and expanded Zamindar's notion of the long partition to examine the cultural, political, economic, and psychological impact upon that kind of partition, but also at the same time, this book can be dedicated as some kind of um, treasure trove by which South Asian partition narratives can be explored. We can also go through Udubasi Butalia's The Other Side of Violence, that the voices of the partition of India. Wait a minute. Let me change the slide also. Yes. There are also, so I have discussed that the book of Gananda Pandey at the same time revisiting India's partition, the other side of violence, and the bearing witness. Next, I will tell you a bit about the partition of memory, unsettling partition, and dialogues. All so uh, let me tell you that where in that partition dialogue and memories of the lost home and the other the outsider of the violence voices for the partition of India and all these books, due to the time constraint, it's not possible for me to tell the main gist of the books, but and you can also go through Ritu Menon's book No Women's Land, Women from Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, right on the partition of India. So these are the books that can be read and read it to understand the nuances of partition. And one book that I want to mention today, especially, that the Barbed Word. It's about the borders and the partitions in South Asia, and it is edited by Joyita Sengupta. There are so many articles, and one of the articles that I have read, it's written by Professor Himadri Lairi, who is also one of the resource person. And his article, the emblematic body that women and nationalism in partition narratives. He has somehow tried to focus on Bapsi Siddha's ice candy man and read the women's body against some kind of nationalist narrative. Apart from that, we can go through Yashodhara Bagchi's and Subharanjan Dasgupta's The Trauma and the Triumph, the gender partition in Eastern India. And if we want to know the history of it, then we should go to Evan Talbot and Gurudhat Singh's The Partition of India, um, Sucheta Mahajan's Independence and the Partition, that erosion of colonial power in India, and Joya Chatterjee's the spoils of partition, to provide the necessary understanding about the history of Indian freedom movement and that of partition on both sides of the border. Now, let me tell you about uh, the tension. That these are the books. Again, I am telling you, this is the Violent Belongings. It's by Kavita Daya. Again, it's Tarun Kasen. It's extremely wonderful book where have tried to show the memory, history, and fiction of partition narratives. There's the book that we should go through to read the article of Professor Himadri Laidi also, and there's another book. And now let me move on to my the last part of my talk, that is about partition and popular Bollywood movies. Look, I haven't chosen those kind of cliched films that we all know, that 1947 art or Train to Pakistan or Tamas. Those are uh, to my knowledge, those are not popular Bollywood movies. So what I have tried to show, the movies that almost was very everywhere. So here I am taking the Sword trilogy. Although the Sword trilogy comprised of Fulton, but I haven't taken it because Fulton is somehow the conflict between India and China. So I have taken his border, his LOC Kargil, his refuge. Next, next I have taken these are the movie stills of the movie Border, and the next I have also taken this kind of movies that Gadar, Bhag Milka Bhag, हिंदुस्तान की कसम, सरफरोश, वीर जरा, मैं हूं ना, एक था टाइगर and बजरंगी भाईजान. So all are the movies where we can see various nuances of partition, various nuances of partition narratives. Uh, and at the same time, and now let me tell you how the tension is created, how the tension is created in those films. So this talk can be taken as a way to visualize the narrative construction of the India-Pakistan border and the human interaction across some kind of liminal space, as depicted by the three films by J.P. Datta that I've just told, that the border, that the refugee, that the LOC, Kargil, and we should know what is LOC. LOC is nothing but a line of control that was formed after the partition of 1947. I'm not going to discuss it because there is not so much time is there. But if we go through the story of border, it claims to be the real life events that happened at the Longwala post of the Indian army during the Indo-Pakistan War of 1971, and a small platoon of 120 Indian soldiers under the leadership of Major Kuldeep Singh, that was enacted by Sunny Deol of Punjab regiment, was pitched against the 2,500 amount something of Pakistan army, and a small group needs to hold the position for a night until the air force comes to assistance, and which can't happen before the dawn. So this high budget multi-star works as a postcard of pretty faces and very masculine heroes. So the tension that is there on the border after the partition in 1947, continuously we are witnessing this kind of tension across the border, and this kind of tension is the aftermath of the partition of 1947, that the continuous fight between Indian army versus Pakistan army across the border, across LOC, across the line at Kashmir, that is continuously going on. And throughout this all these movies, we can see that I'm telling about some of the name of the heroes in that border, blasted rival tank and dies when he decides. Can you remember that face of Bhairo Singh? Let me tell you that this is Bhairo Singh, this is Sunil Shetty, and how he has sacrificed his life for that. And at the same time, and at the same time, I can tell you that this kind of acting on that time can tell that how to some extent those movies are highly dealt on overacting plots. And Virus Singh blasts a rival tank and dies when he decides to run towards the opponent with anti-tank mine, and Shetty here salivates and cries historically, and he's telling that Shakti Ma, give me the power from the goddess Shakti, and delivers a performance that will create a space for him in the world of overacting. And so the politics of magnum opus revolve around the theme of incredibly tense toward of survival. And through the songs of like Mere Dushman, Mere Bhai, towards the end tries to convey the message that the war brings losses only, but you can't deny at the same time can't deny sending the strong anti-Pakistani message. And a closer look in the long inspirational monologue by Sunny Deol reveals that it maybe unintentionally has the potential of fueling the anti-Muslim sentiments too. For example, taking the slogans in the film of army's inclination towards religious symbols, and at the same time the temple also. Now, in the second movie by JP Datta, that is on LOC Kargil and with the same name, that is a movie based on the true life incidents about the group of soldiers were the various battalions of Indian Army who bravely fought against the Pakistani soldiers and won the Battle of Kargil. And the and in that movie, so many characters are there. So many characters are there. There is Manoj Bajpayee, there is Sanjay Kapoor, there is Sanjay Dutt, there is Sunil Shetty, there is Akshay Khanna, there is Ajay Devgan, there is Abhishek Bachchan, there is Saif Ali Khan, there is Raj Babbar, there is there is Manesh Raut, there is Vikram Saluja, there is Sarat Kapoor. So all they tried to enact that tension, and the Pakistani soldiers attacked that Kargil sector in early 1999, and they are at advantage when they're attacking from the top, and the Indian government at the same time decides to send their best troops that I have already mentioned. These are the names to capture the position. So it is also telling that some kind of tension is there on the border. This kind of tension is depicted in those movies, and all the tensions are regarding those thin red line, which is the inspiration for LOC, or not even a patch in 1965 war epic. So hakikat, but nevertheless it's the superbly directed film with good acting from all star to some extent, and superb cinematography somehow succeeded to depict the tension within this movie. Now, at the same time, I can tell you, while I'm doing it, this kind of films have some coherent narratives also, because the stories of the characters blend into one another, and even their love stories get also repetitive, and all the films meanders without a plot. A certain constant consistency emerges. So in the last part, in the last slide, I will tell you that how the politics of adaptation, or to some extent the theory of Jane Edder, is the transmedial policy of adaptation, comes into play to understand the nuances of this kind of coherent broken narrative. The third movie of JP Datta's trilogy, that is Refugee, and here what we can see that the Bihar-based Manjur Ahmed and his wife and his mother and his daughter decides to relocate to its East Pakistan after the partitioning of Hindustan during 1948, following the tussle between Pakistan General Bhutto and Sheikh Mujib Rahman, which led to the formation of Bangladesh. So whereas Manjur and several other Muslims were forced to relocate to Pakistan. So in order to do this, they crossed two borders, one with India and Bangladesh, and the second was with India and Pakistan. And the route from Bangladesh leads to Dhaka, and then to Guwahati, and then to Delhi, and then to Ajmer, and then to Bhuj, and then to Pakistan's Hajipir. So it's a kind of broken narrative about the refugee, which try his best to locate his land, to locate his identity, and as far as they get as Bhuj, then afterward they're assisted by Jain Muhammad Son, known only as the refugee, who helps them to trek their way across the Puran desert. So here we can see that how this kind of film like Refugee, which ends in some kind of delirious sequence in which Naz gives birth to a baby at the stroke of midnight on August 14, a bang on the border, narrates the life of the people living there. Now, there is another film, that is Gadar Ek Prem Katha, and there we all can immediately remember the dialogue of Sunny Deol and the dialogue of Amrish Puri, where they are all trying to enact their own nationalist ethos. Also talked about the tension that is still coming out during or after the traumatic past or traumatic event of partition. And it's a film directed by Anil Sharma, shows the subject set in the partition period and making a wonderful cinema out of it. And the film shows a romantic love story of a Sikh truck driver and a Muslim girl into Pak separation, and how the Muslim girl is separated from the Hindu, and where the lead attacks happen, and that Pakistani girl whose name was Sakina is somehow left behind when Amrish Puri, his father, flees to India, and how during that time when a lot of people went to Pakistan, he was left behind, and how a Hindu man tried to save that that particular or women and different of a different religion, and how in course of the journey they have married and they have a son, and when they come to know about Sakina's parents, they were in a breathless condition, they are alive and they are in good position in Pakistan. So Sakina went to meet them in Pakistan, and Amrish Puri then stops the arrival of Tara. So he later allows calling him on the virtue of gaining political mileage and pulling him and arresting him. But but the Jat was unstoppable, and it's not the. And I'm not talking about the pulling of the hand pump, but yes, it's a true fact that the India's heroes give their best, and at the same time, Pakistan. It means all the heroes of India and Pakistan, they are trying their best to uphold their political national identity, but in course of that the tension is continuously breaking the treaty or breaking the um, harmony between India and Pakistan. We can immediately remember that even love often sometimes fail to excel that kind of tension. We can immediately remember the name of Virjara. That's a romantic story of two star-crossed lovers, emphasis on how similar relationships and the emotions exist in both the countries with a modernity bringing how Pakistan and its people in the film starring that popular Shah Rukh Khan, and it was a box office hit, but you can immediately see that how Manoj Bajpayee was some kind of villain there, and that kind of arch villain tried to break the relationship between Preeti Zinta and Shah Rukh Khan. And next, we can also immediately remember that movie Bhag Milkha Bhag, and there also in I guess it was released in July 2013. It's a film about one of the Indian athletes, and the film is based on the struggle of Indian national runner and an Olympian Milkha Singh. And the film is a biographical sports drama directed by Rakesh Om Prakash Mehra. And the film started with the image of disappointment at the 1960 Rome Olympic. But here also, in course of the journey, he shows how Milkha was a partition refugee who lost his family relatives in the communal riots during partition of India. And the story takes us from Milkha's childhood in the Punjab, the then Pakistan, and the scene of a Sikh boy in the newly born Islamic Republic presents the beginning of the trauma of the partition. And this kind of trauma, according to her, it's a kind of creates a kind of post memory where generations after generations are bearing this kind of trauma of partition. So this kind of narrative, this kind of films can be reread from the theoretical perspective of trauma, memory, and post memory, and how and there also you can see how the Sikh boy village is under attack uh, um, um, by the Pathans during the partition, and the director very amply shows the scene of tension in the village. This kind of tension that I'm talking about from the very beginning, and in another scene that again the director presents the Holocaust of Pakistan, and pictured um, shows us about the shores with blood, gun shooting, and the slaughter of Hindu people, a surge of human love, and the bloodshed, and the shooting of him, so many people, and sometimes later the kid returns to gutted yet to wait house to find that the bodies of his father and mother were dead. So it's a kind of scene. This kind of scene was full of evil evidences. The scene of struggle for food shows that the many human beings lost everything during that partition trauma. And that Sikh boy became a member of the gang and stolen coal for money. And later on in the film, that runner Milkha Singh has visited his village in the Pakistan, and he can remember the heartbreaking memories of the harrowing partition violence that haunted the spirit of that winning man also. But this tragedy also ends when in childhood tell friends that it's not people but circumstances that were bad. Now, if I am telling you about the tension there, then we can immediately remember Bajrangi Bhaijaan. How Bajrangi Bhaijaan, that blockbuster drama featuring Salman Khan, in the ultimate ode to India-Pakistan harmonic relations, where Khan plays a golden-hearted devotee of Lord Hanuman. See that Khan plays a golden-hearted devotee of Lord Hanuman, monkey god, and who takes a mute Pakistani child lost in India back home during his journey. He faces challenges, but it is a happy ending when the child reunites her family. But in course of the journey, that Salman Khan was treated very badly, and he, to some extent, this kind of tension that is created throughout the film, he can say that this kind of tension enables the film to show how Salman, within that certain periphery in Pakistan, without the proper visa, mm, uh, tried his best to survive. And so everything is there, and so many films are going on. Sarfaroz is there, and again I'm telling you why I have taken. There are so many films. There are films like Garam Hawa. There are films like Kitarastro. There are films like 1947 Art, Train to Pakistan. There are so many films. There are films like Hamas. mm, and there are other films, Kashmir. But I have taken the popular blockbuster movies that I have taken into account as the popular movie. And at the same time, let me tell you that while we are dealing with all this thing, cinema becomes as a kind of social conflict. And let me talk about the cinematic theory to some extent about Vincent Hediger, when he's an expert in cinematic studies, and he's the professor um, in the University of Bochum. According taking his account of reading cinema in terms of partition, it can be some kind of opinion that this kind of entertainment films are particularly suited to tackling the issues of social conflicts, tackling the issues of tension. And this popular cinema in particular, with its dramatic terms of events and concise formula, is ideal for highlighting social conflicts in an effective manner that will reach a broad span of people. And in addition, popular films are always have to be relevant. In other words, cinema goers must be able to relate what is happening on the screen and what is going on in their lives. And they have to be successful because they are so costly to produce, and the social conflicts that are addressed and dealt within Bollywood films are to certain extent both are a model and a screen for the audience. And now, in the final slide, let me tell you, while this kind of this kind of films are based upon some kind of novels written by notable novelists like Train to Pakistan, Ice Candy Man. These are the novels, and it is all these novels are also adapted. There is a kind of politics of adaptation. Now you can read these films through the theory of this politics of adaptation. And while dealing it in the consecutive use of media products, there will be an overall what is being directly perceived by memory traces of earlier media experiences. And such reception process can be described as a form of transmedial imagination that I am telling. This theory of transmedial imagination propounded by Eder, with two different it has two different aspects. The transfer of information, it's about the sensory and about the emotional experience, and at the same way from the other media. And this kind of transmedial adaptation can rise three kind of questions: how the adaptation and transmediality generally related to each other, at the same time, in what transmedial context does adaptation occur today, and how is it influenced by them? And what theological tendencies does transmedial adaptation contribute to us? So we have to remember one thing, that cinema is peculiarly a special form of culture. And while this kind of cinema they are dealing with the nuance of partition, it's best understood in terms of organization space. They are creating some kind of space, and both space in film, the space of the shot and the space of the narrative setting, and the geographical relationship of various settings in a sequence in a film, and the mapping of this tension in the film and the filming space and the lived urban space by cinema creates some kind of cultural practice. And the special organization of this industry at the level of production and distribution and exhibition creates that same kind of tension that is also prevalent in the text. But there are certain kind of changes. This kind of novels, when they are reeled or they are enacted in a film, the novels are to some extent changes. The novels are adapted according to the distribution, to the production, and on the market dependency, and the role of cinema uh, be, become globalized. The events of partition become globalized, and thus one of the major contention of my talk is also how cinema becomes a kind of special system, and that withstanding the traditional textual practice of much film studies, it is for some kind of, it's a kind of special system. And this kind of spatial system, it allows the full partition, the traumas of partition, the nuggets of partition, the nuance of partition are enacted, are adapted in a certain kind of cinematic theme, in a certain kind of form and industry, and which is highly globalized and highly capitalist in nature. And if we want to read more about how film can produce this kind of narrative, this kind of partition, I will tell you all to go through three books mainly. First of all, it's by Cinema and the City and the Film and the Urban Societies in a global context. It is edited by Tony Fitzmaurice and Mark Shale. And the secondly, you can go through there. There's the transmedial adaptation. It's the transmediality, politics of adaptation, concept, form, and strategies. It's beautiful essay written by Jane Seder, and you can find the essay in the politics of adaptation, media convergence, and ideology by Dan Sussler Forrest and Pascal Nicholas. And at the same time, if you want to read the basic nuances of how a work, how some kind of tension is being showcased in this kind of film, and how the filming, how the camera operates to show, then I will tell you all to go through the book James Monaco's How to Read a Film. And it will help you all to understand the nuances, how the politics or how the memories of partition to some extent are politicized and to some extent are fabricated to make space within this certain globalized capitalist system. Thank you. Yes, Surajita. Surajita, if there is any question answer,
Yes. I was. Yes. Yes. So first of all,
okay.
thank you very much, Dr. Gautam Karmakar, for your excellent presentation. Even though there have been some sort of disturbances due to technical glitch, which is not in our hand, basically. But yes, your presentation along with your slides, those were extremely vivid, and I hope the question and answers that are right now flooding our boxes. Everybody is wanting to know about something or the other from your talk. Let me, first of all, select those. Dr. Arun Mukherjee, who is a professor of English, he basically wants to tell
Yes.
you that Waiting for Mahatma is not a book on partition. He wants to tell that it basically focuses on Gandhism, on Indian, atmosphere. So therefore, the book that you have mentioned, he told that,
Yes.
sir, it's not basically about partition. What is your own take on that?
Okay, Dada. I can read a few questions. If you can tell, then there is a question by, yes, so you
Yes.
talked about nationalist sentiment built by movies. Yes,
Movies.
absolutely. Can any other sentiment be presented against political will? Yes, to some extent. While we are talking about the nationalist sentiment built by the movies, at the same time, we are also building anti-nationalist propaganda throughout some kind of partisan narratives, and again, and apart from this, there is a kind of uh, pseudo nationalist agenda also, that is also can be showcased by all these partisan novels, or the films that are based on partisan novels. And apart from the political, there is a nationalist zeal, and at the same time, there is a productivity. And if we go through Wolfgang Isert's notion of a receptive theory, then we can understand that how we are in the era of late capitalism. We are trying to produce something, and that is why you can see when Chapak is released, and at the same time when Panipat is released, or there is another movie this with this kind of humor, Hinduist propaganda. That film gained a huge popularity. That film was a box office hit. But this kind of movie like Chapak, it was not that kind of hit. So it's also depends on how we are catering our agenda to the audience.
Yeah. Gautam, yeah, you
Yes,
beautifully answered it. Now,
if you
another
want to go
another
through
question.
the books,
Another question is that Ranjana Mehrotra, she asked this question: do you think that cinema has been able to portray partition with an even vision? The images of partition are colored by these films. Cannot it be shown in a stoical manner? What is your take on that, Ranjana Mehrotra? The films have to be shown in a
the
stoical
cinema has
manner,
been able to portray partition with an
even
Within
vision.
the image of partition are colored by this film. Can it be shown in a streaky manner? Yes, it can be. To some extent, yes. There are so many films, there are so many documentaries also that, that have shown the partition in a stoical manner, that have shown the dark violence, that have shown the dark truth of partition. And yes, if we can see LOC Kargil, there is another question that I have also seen regarding LOC Kargil. So this kind of films, if I tell you that yes, we can see both in LOC Kargil or in other films, we can see the tension. We can see the because the line of control, it is dividing the Kashmir into two equal parts. The Indian part, I am also taking that other question, that called Jammu or Kashmir, and the Pakistani part, that is the Azad Kashmir in Pakistan, and that is the Pakistani occupied Kashmir, that is POK. So the tension is how Indians, and Kargil is one of the sectors in that line of control in the spring of the 1999, and Indian army discovered that Pakistan troops have made inroads into Indian territory. That creates the tension, that captures the fortification of that Indian land as abandoned during the winter. And from that strategic heights, the Pakistanis could and did attack an arterial Indian highway. So the mobilization of forces to repel the Indian army was one of the biggest challenges, and this can make everyone. This can create some kind of panic also. And at the same time, while doing all this, so many deaths are there, bloodshed are there, heroes. And if we see the movie Border also, apart from Sunny Deol, there are hardly any hero. Sunil Shetty was dead. There, Akshay Khanna was also dead. They were killed. So all the heroes, apart from a major hero or two, they are killed, and so many widows are there. So stories are being shown there in a stoical manner. To some extent, in a movies like Bajrangi Bhaijaan, or in another movies, there you can see some kind of romantic songs also, or even in the romantic Bollywood movie, while we are showing the tension, there you can see some kind of relief, that that we can see, you can see as a kind of comic relief. And these are the now that is why while we are talking about JP Datta's LOC Kargil, that was not so much hit. But if we can talk about Veer Zara, it's a huge hit because this kind of romance also cater to our taste.
It's lost. Hello, hello, madam. Yeah. The technical, some technical faults arise once again. We are not hearing Dr. Gautam Parmar right now. But whatever he basically tried to put in his lecture, uh, that is the politics of adaptation we talked about in films. And there are some questions cropping up regarding the the historical nature, whether films can be unbiased, unbiased. That is a big question for the people who are participating in this webinar. And there are some very important questions also. Sadly, we have lost into Dr. Gautam Pawar, but I wholeheartedly congratulate him and thank him for his wonderful presentation. And whatever he answered, he was of the view, was of the opinion that yes, films can be made in an unbiased manner, but and it should not be catering to the popular uh, popular taste of the inhabitants of a particular country. The film can be made in India, made in Pakistan, made in Bangladesh, or wherever it is. But the fact is that the creator and the producer, they must be aware of the neutrality of movies. That is a very important aspect. And uh, thank you very much, Professor Gautam Karmakar, for your wonderful presentation. And we hope that in the near future, when we are going to conduct such seminars once again, we'll be having you on our podium once again. Thank you very much. And right now, uh, we'll be moving on to our next speaker. Uh, Next speaker, that first technical session is over, the question and answer part is also over. Now we'll be moving on to our next speaker, that is Professor Roshni Shenputta, and she has also kindly consented that she will be there in this webinar, and it is our time. It is our time to have her on the seminar right now. And Professor Roshni Shenputta, she is working at Holland or Europe, and she's uh, so she's working there as a yes as an assistant professor there, Professor Roshni Shenputta, and she's also interested. What I've seen from her topic, that she's going to talk about partition and movies also. Movies is a very interesting sort of topic with her. Also, she has shown numerous enthusiasm in that part also. And whatever Professor Gautam Karmakar in his speech is told, the responses from the audience tells that they have immensely enjoyed the lecture, and there are lots of questions that remain unanswered. Sorry, the people who are still sending us questions, because we have lost the link to Dr. Gautam Karmakar. There are some very good questions regarding what sort of theory should be applied to the film adaptation, and some sort of political questions also we saw from Kashmir. But yes, we are really very sorry that we cannot connect with Dr. Gautam Karmakar, and I myself cannot answer these questions on this behalf. So that's why I refuse because of the loss of the link to Dr. Karmakar. Okay. Uh,
Thank you very much. I offer my apologies because our resource person has just got himself disconnected and he could not complete the question hour session. However, we are very happy to have with us our next speaker for today's international webinar on United by Pens, Divided by Fence Perspectives on Partition Literature. Our next speaker, Dr. Roshni Sengupta, is an assistant professor in the Institute of Middle and Far East, Jagiellonian University, Krakow, Poland. She has earlier been assistant professor at the Leiden Institute of Area Studies, Leiden University, Netherlands, and fellow, International Institute for Asian Studies, Leiden. Her interests of research lie in areas of South Asian politics and culture and post-colonial studies. Roshni's monograph titled "Reading the Muslim on Celluloid: Bollywood, Representation and Politics" has recently been published by Primus India. Currently, she is finalizing a two-part edited anthology on media and literature in post-partition South Asia by Routledge, and working on an edited volume on visual entanglements and politics in Bengali cinema, also by Routledge. She has published widely in peer-reviewed journals and is also prolific on popular news and opinion portals. Madam shall be addressing today on the lecture topic "Desolate Daughters, a Feminist Reading of Partition Films." So let us now join our hands together and welcome our speaker, Dr. Roshni Sengupta. Madam, it's over to you now.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and good morning from Krakow. Um, my name is Roshni Sengupta, as Ms. Deb Burma just mentioned, and I would like to, at the outset, thank Dr. Professor Surojit Sen for inviting me to be part of this international webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. Sen, and Ms. Deb Burma, who's been extremely diligent in all her organization with regard to the webinar. So basically, I will be focusing on a feminist reading of two partition films primarily. One of them being Pinjar, which was released in 2008, and the other one is a Pakistani film, although an independent film, called Khamosh Pani, that came out um, a little earlier. It came out earlier, yeah. Um, so basically, my paper attempts to delineate and focus on the. I will now share my screen with you because I have a PowerPoint. And I am going to stop my camera, so please bear with me because I would like to focus on the slides. And you will hear my voice, of course. I hope everyone can see the slides, and I'm audible as well. All right, I think I will just continue.
Yes, madam. Please continue with your deliberation, madam. And it would be better if you would switch on your camera, please.
You want me to switch it on? Okay. All right.
Yes, ma'am.
So
please continue.
My paper basically attempts to focus on the common narrative thread that runs through subsequent cinematic treatises on the situation of women during partition, particularly those who were kidnapped and sexually violated during the vivisection. It proposes to construct a cultural and memorialized history of partition through a reading of mediated representations of literary engagements with the event. In doing so, I would like to consider films such as 1947 Earth, although my focus would be on Pinjar, which was Amrita Pritam's novel, and Khamosh Pani, which was a film not adapted, but I picked it up because it is a Pakistani counterpart, as similar films, as seminal films actually addressing female abductions during partition and the memorialization of trauma through cinema. The paper will take my lecture will take a feminist approach to addressing the question um, of the possession of the female body as the symbolic occupation of the nation. So Professor Lahiri has worked extensively on this aspect, and I hope he will bear with me here if he's hearing me out or if he's listening to me. Several narrative strands in the form of oral histories, literary engagements, and cultural representations have emerged from, let's call it, the burning cinders of partition. One such strand encompasses the stories of women who were abducted during the Great Upheaval and their subsequent recovery and rehabilitation. Some of these women were merely girls at the time that they were abducted. If you look at a cultural or a literary historiography of the calamitous moment, it emerges from the rich literary legacy of the subcontinent. We can see it all over in the unnerving pathos of Manto's stories like Kholdo, Moselle, Thanda Gosht, and Hattak, and Amrita Pritam's novel Pinjar, on which the film is also based. A number of these literary engagements with the trauma and pain of partition have found resonance through mediated representations, as we can see. Pritam's novel was adapted for a film of the same name in 2008, preceded by the film adaptation of Bapsi Sidhwa's Cracking India, also known as Ice Candy Man, as 1947 Earth. Both films mirrored the darkness of Tamas, which was a much earlier adaptation of partition and of Bhisham Sahani's novel, and Pamela Rook's adaptation of Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan. Theoretically, cinematic representations of the traumas of the past lead to the creation of collective memories about the historical specificities surrounding a particularly debilitating event or a moment in history. Charu Mathur has tried to argue that since colonization and the struggle for independence culminated in the partition, it is one of the most sweeping points of reality or events in history that India faced in the 19th, 20th century, and a number of films therefore have been inspired by this phase of history. But to move a little bit into visual theory, and particularly because it is important to a discussion here, is the idea of the popular visual medium and the question of how vision is constructed, how we see, are able to see, allowed to see, or made to see, or even the socialization that works with us in how to see a particular image or a series of moving images. And in that process, what are we unseeing? And what are we instead, rather, unseeing remains the central premise of the whole concept of visuality. Western philosophical traditions, Western visual theory, contemporary Western visual theory has also focused on the concept of the scopic regime, where visual images are seen as a form of visual gluttony, the way in which we are engaged with visual images at this point in time is seen by theorists like Donna Haraway, for example, as visual gluttony. Roland Barthes, therefore, has gone further to look at cinema, not for what it means or symbolizes, but for how it almost succeeds in meaning making itself. So there is a cinematic meaning making going on, which is probably different from the historical event or the actual event, you know. So Barth is looking at categorizing certain films as full of significance without signification. I would also, just to give you another idea, another sort of perspective on the theory of visuality and popular culture, talk very briefly about the American visual theorist John Cavalti, who has delineated four major concepts that help in the study of popular culture. And you will understand why I'm talking about this, because I want to sort of tie up these ends at the end of the lecture. So he says that all popular cultural products, primarily popular cinema, would end with would entail the following: A, the analysis of cultural themes; B, the concept of medium; C, the idea of myth; and D, the concept of formula. So popular cinema embodies these concepts in no small measure, playing most provocatively on the idea of the myth and employing the formula of structuring cultural products. It makes use of what Cavalti has described as the game dimension. So this is a formula wherein the story must be resolved any which way, right? Okay, so just moving from the theoretical sphere and coming back to a question on women in partition films. So what exactly are we trying to address here? We are trying to address the question of abduction and violation of women from all the three communities majorly affected by the partition during this calamitous event. And before I get into analyzing the films, I would like to spend a moment on talking about the actual act of these abductions and sexual violation that as it occurred. So it is estimated that around 75,000 to 100,000 women were kidnapped and raped. And on the screen, you can see, accounts of of the violence that was occurring in any case. Andrew Major has noted that the large-scale abduction and rape of girls seem to have been part of a systematic ethnic cleansing in regions such as Gurgaon near Delhi. All the three communities involved in partition violence seem to bear almost equal responsibility where the women were concerned. Women were victimized during the direct action day violence in Kolkata, in Bengal, then during the Noakhali violence, during the anti-Muslim massacres in Bihar in 1946, also in the Garmukteshwar anti-Muslim massacres in Uttarakhand, but that is now Uttarakhand. Systematic violence was recorded in 1947 in Rawalpindi region. Women were abducted from trains. Of course, most of us know these details. Both the Sikh, Muslim, and Hindu communities cited revenge as their motive for abducting women from the rival communities. After the partition had taken place, an attempt at recovery was launched on both sides of the border. Ritu Menon and Kamala Bhasin have written about the difficulties such a task entailed. To accomplish the recoveries, ads were placed in newspapers giving details of the women. The task was then taken up by social workers on both sides of the border in Punjab. They have recorded all sorts of ruses that were needed by the social workers to find and identify the missing women. Sometimes, disguising themselves as bangle sellers or fruit vendors. You see these images in films like Pinjar. So it is important to understand that these are the narratives that the film is also trying to portray. No captor was willing to give up his claim on the women that he had abducted. So women were spirited away, hidden in tandoors. This is something that Ritu Menon and Kamala Bhasin have written, disguised as sisters and mothers, but never voluntarily given up. The arrangements that came about after partition for the return and repatriation, however, denied the women any agency in determining where they chose to live or who they married in the final analysis. In many cases, the abducted women had married their abductors. That is something that you see in a film like Khamosh Pani, and even had children with them. So questions of chastity and purity were raised. Women who had been violated or who had had sex or had impregnated by men of other religions were shunned by their families and communities. Some of them, even though they were taken back, were made to give up their children to orphanages. So the operation of recovery and restoration returned around 22,000 Muslim women, and about 8,000 Hindu and Sikh women. I mean, these numbers can vary in different accounts, but this is close to what is usually estimated. Urvashi Butalia, who Dr. Karmakar also quoted, writes in The Other Side of Silence that unlike the popular belief that the aggressors and abductors were always outsiders, there were many examples where um, where women of all ages were abducted by men from their own village. The social workers trying to recover women reported, social workers who were trying to recover these women reported of women being kidnapped for various reasons. For instance, older women were kidnapped for property disputes, over property disputes. So unlike the dominant discourse or the dominant narrative of women's experiences of partition, they have been and they were violated for many, many reasons by their own men as well. So that is something that we must definitely keep in mind. So I'm going to quickly go over these slides because we've just talked about these films very, very briefly and come and dwell on this particular slide. Um, when we talk about partitions of the subcontinent, I do not think we can ignore the 1971 war, which led to the creation of Bangladesh as an independent nation, because it also had its women victims and survivors. And you see this picture on the screen. There are several accounts of rape camps being organized by the Pakistani military, where abducted Bangla women were made available to the soldiers. These rape survivors came, some of them did survive, of course, were termed as birangonas. So this is, one of those eponymous images of the birangona or war heroines to help them reintegrate into their families and communities once the war had ended. So some of these girls who were put in these rape camps were just 13 years old. Just for the information of the audiences here, I would like to tell you about a lesser known film on the rape of women during the 1971 war and the rape camps is by Mrityunjay Devrat called Children of War. I think it came out in 2016, if I'm not mistaken. An estimated 200,000 to 400,000 Bangladeshi women of all ages were raped during the war, and the supporting Bihari and Bengali Razakars and the militias operating within East Pakistan, erstwhile East Pakistan, were all complicit in these actions. Okay, I would like to now return to our story on what was happening in Punjab through the narratives of Puro in Pinjar and Aisha in Khamosh Pani. So first, I will talk about the character of Puro and the temporal leap that she makes as Hamida towards the middle of the film. So the films under scrutiny here present narratives that foreground the violation of women's bodies in conjunction with a symbolic occupation of the nation. The dominant argument about women's bodies being the site of the expression of national pride and honor undergirds the cinematic narratives of both these films. So let's talk about Chandra Prakash Dwivedi's Pinjar. Pinjar represents the agony of a young Hindu woman abducted by a Muslim man during the communal frenzy of partition, the family's subsequent denial of the woman, and the relative empowerment of the female protagonist as a hero of the time at the end of the film. There is, of course, a 1947 Earth, also considered widely as Deepa Mehta's partition classic, addressed the issue of abductions during the partition, though in a more recalcitrant manner, I would say. The other film that I want to focus on is Khamosh Pani, where the character of Aisha amalgamates the visual traumas of both Puro in Pinjar and Shanta in 1947 Earth and forms a temporal connection between the past, her abduction and rape during the partition violence, and her consequent marriage to one of the rapists, and the present as a Pakistani Muslim woman caught in the maelstrom of radicalism and fundamentalism in contemporary Pakistan. Um, in an unwitting manner, the duality of her existence remains the mainstay of the visual imagery of the film as she struggles to come to terms with the scars of her past and the brute force reality of the present, particularly because of her rapidly radicalizing son. So, the other important factor that we need to consider here is that of the protagonist, the male protagonist in Pinjar, whose name was Rashid. So Rashid essentially prevents a shocked and distraught Puro from jumping into a well, marries her the next day. And this marriage then is symbolic of the temporal movement of the woman from one life to the next. From a previous life as a happy woman awaiting her wedding day, Puro is now the community outcast. She is abducted by a man not only from another village but from another religion. So the shunning of Puro by her family is justified by the narrative of Pinjar as resulting from the consciousness of violence existing between Hindus and Muslims at the time of partition. In the film, as is quite interesting, the partition takes on the force of a natural disaster, an anomaly in the face of customary unity and camaraderie that mark the daily lives of common people in Punjab primarily. So Pinjar is, presumably a testimonial to the travails of the forgotten women victims of partition and attempts to reconcile the temporal dislocation of the trauma of physical violence. After her marriage to Rashid, Puro is rechristened Hamida, a name that is tattooed on her arm. There is a sequence in the film where she is frantically. So you see a picture of Rashid on the screen for those who haven't seen the film. So this is her as Hamida. So in this particular scene, she's trying to frantically attempting to rub the name away, but she can't. So the complete temporal shift occurs as Hamida gives up yearning for release. Through the film, through the narrative of the film, you see that at some point she just gives up the fight, essentially. So the historical discourse is depicted through four separate yet interconnected strands of representation. First, the male protagonist remains the centerpiece of the revenge drama being played out on the screen, as he is defiant in his resolve to avenge his family's honor, allegedly brought to disrepute by Puro's moneylender father. Second, as the aggressive male transforms into a mature partner or a mature husband, he remains constantly traumatized by the gravity of his own action, abducting and then forcing himself on a helpless woman. Third, the woman, forced into making a temporal journey between her previous life and the next, accepts her fate and attempts to prevent the same from befalling a relative. Lastly, the traumatized woman, abandoned by her family to keep dishonor at bay, appears to find solace in the arms of her abductor and tormentor. So Rashid, by now, has started playing the role of a caring husband who, despite the suffering and pain of unrequited love, respects the woman's decision to abstain from any conjugal relations with him. Um, this is the point at which Pinjar moves away, comes more in line actually with Amrita Pritam's story, positing a complete antithesis to the dominant discourse of the violation of Hindu women by wanton Muslim men. Although Pinjar can be accused of a certain kind of ideological bias, which is true for most of the films that are being made, in the that most of the recent films in the last 20 years or so. Um, the characterization of Rashid is a source of subliminal atonement for the narrative. Not only does Rashid carry the burden of history on his shoulders, he ultimately proves to be a rock against which Puro leans when confronted with a difficult situation, whether to cross the border into Hindustan with her brother Trilok and Ramchand, her fiance, or to remain with the man who is now her husband. And the force, as Puro discovers, behind the reunion of Trilok and his wife, Lajo, who was also abducted during the partition. So, in what appears as an intriguing paradigm shift, somewhere along the narrative of the film, Puro, or now she's known as Hamida, begins to see herself as the keeper of the home and hearth of her Muslim husband and not abductor. As the film would have us believe, Puro therefore has reconciled to her fate as the wife of a Muslim peasant, someone who has stopped fighting and given up hope of going back to her previous life. The woman even begins to respond to her husband as he addresses her, while going about household chores, leading to a melancholy quality to their relationship. The seemingly and supposedly natural gift possessed by women to be able to successfully make adjustments to their life is vested in the person of Puro. Countless accounts of female abductions during partition tell the stories of women raped and married several times till they come to a settled conclusion over their predicament. In her recounting of the collective trauma of partition, Urvashi Butalia has emphasized on the women that both India and Pakistan forgot. Puro's character in Pinjar is further symbolic of the power structures as they existed and continue to exist in several rural parts of the subcontinent. The settlement of family disputes by abducting women from each other's clans remains the fundamental focus of the narrative of the film. Further, the continuation of such an inhumanity, even to the early period of the 20th century, becomes apparent as the film progresses. The body of the woman, therefore, emerges as a battlefield over which clan and family battles are fought. Puro's body has lost all vestiges of agency and choice, and has thus become merely a site for revenge, a literal zone of conflict between male protectors of family honor and pride. Also significant in the reading of the film is the almost non-existent role of the women in safeguarding family pride and prestige. Even as Puro becomes the victim of an age-old rivalry between the two clans, her volition rather, in the entire episode remains rudimentary and unexplained until she decides to help her sister-in-law escape the clutches of her abductor. So until the point that she wants to take matters in her own hands, she is basically represented as a woman who has accepted her fate. So the narrative seems to naturalize the pain and trauma of this woman as a mode of reconciliation. As she abets the escape of her female relative from the clutches of her abductor and rapist, she almost acquires somehow an aura of inordinate strength. She has therefore finally accepted the company of her abductor husband, as she, in the climax of the film, refuses to part ways with him, even as her fiance and brother attempt to persuade her to leave. Not only has the body of the woman ultimately succumbed to a patriarchal superstructure, it now stands as a symbol of the supreme sacrifice. So the portrayal of the woman's body as a site for dispute settlement and partition of land emerges as a point of focus in many of the film narratives that deal with a central female protagonist against the background of partition. While Puro's abductor makes her the object of atonement for a past event of sexual assault and humiliation, an entire mob of men presumably forced themselves on Shanta in 1947 Earth after having publicly abducted her from her employer's bungalow. It is here that we see the dismemberment of the souls of the two women, while the partition remains a mute witness. So therefore, the whole allegory of a natural disaster becomes more and more, becomes more sort of visible here. The other film that I would like to consider briefly in the lecture that I will now, conclude is Khamosh Pani. Khamosh Pani is an independent film which was not supported any which way by government agencies, was directed by a courageous woman filmmaker from Pakistan called Sabiha Somar. It is an outcome of the director's research work on such women abductees of partition. Sabiha Somar's story of a Sikh woman abducted, raped, and then married by one of her rapists, now living as Aisha in Pakistan, represents several strands of any discussion on the portrayal of religious minorities in cinema in general and subcontinental cinema in particular. To begin with, Aisha's sexual ordeal as a Sikh woman in the throes of partition, in a terminal way, illustrates her as a victim of Muslim rapists, which remains perceptibly in the background of her present life as a middle-aged Muslim widow, grappling with an intensely mundane and increasingly pragmatic existence. So the duality of identities embodied by Aisha presents her with an ephemeral, even iconic halo, unseen by those around her. Victimhood finally overwhelms religious identity in a remarkably stark climax sequence as Aisha completes what she had almost been forced um, into many years ago, just after being brutalized. She commits suicide by jumping into the well, into the village well to assuage the fears of her son, who is now, completely in the clutches of extremists, as you can see, or from this particular grab from the film. Her ordeal as a Sikh in a past life appears to come full circle to consume her present. Aisha's climactic suicide further tends to rationalize the appropriation of the woman's body as a site of a nationalistic turf war. Not only does the representation address existing narratives about the excesses of partition, it places a disproportionate responsibility on the woman to uphold the honor of the clan and nation. In foregrounding the futility of these hegemonic narratives, the films under study provide a definitive critique of the appropriating tendency of extremist ideologies on both sides of the border. When viewed as a trope of political representation in cinema, the occupation of women's bodies during partition becomes a conceptual thread that runs through and connects the films, rearranging the relative ambiguity enveloping the development of the cinematic landscape as it emerged on both sides of the border after partition. While Pinjar and films like 1947 Earth present a hegemonic and subliminal view of the abductors, Khamosh Pani makes a contextual break and portrays a nuanced reflection of the events as they unfold on screen. The film is also grounded in contemporary reality, which, unlike the two other Indian films that almost seem to compete with each other for their space on the dominant representational universe, makes it more conceptually and effectively sound. The manner in which the women survivors of partition is visualized must also be examined through the narrative lens of the visuality of offending communities. So the need for the popular narrative to conclude logically that I mentioned in the beginning of my narration, John Cavalti's theory of logical conclusion, often takes on vicarious forms owing to commercial interests of, box office and so on and so forth, sets about a rearrangement of emotional tropes throughout the film, like suffering, loss, and guilt, against an essentially political background story, which was what the partition was. For example, while the woman abductee in Pinjar is in the final assessment represented as a sacrificial survivor, although she acquires, some kind of a iconic heroine-like quality towards the end of the film, the Muslim abductor transforms from a guilt-ridden individual to an ally of the woman, giving her support in her final quest for redemption. All right, so I will stop here and take any questions that are there. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much, madam. Thank you very much. Excellent, brilliant sort of presentation, I must tell you.
I hope I kept.
Yeah, it has been fantastic. Really, really enjoyed. Really enjoyed your deliberation, your lecture. Now questions are coming up. One. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. One academician, Gunjan Chaturvedi, she is asking this question. Many have heard the overtones of the story of Rama and Ravana in the novel as well as the movie Pinjar, with Ramchandra having a Rama-like image and Rashid almost like Ravana. What is your take on that?
In the film as well, you see, I will talk more about the film than the book. In the film as well, the mere fact that the Puro's fiance's name is Ramchandra, it gives him a Rama-like quality. He's also seen as someone who's who's willing or who is enabled to sacrifice. So he's willing to wait. He's willing to give time to Puro to return. So he's still at the end waiting for her. So he has this Rama-like quality, whereas obviously the antagonist, that is Rashid, although he changes from being a pure antagonist to a antagonist protagonist through the narrative of the film as the film progresses, and at some point he emerges as a bigger hero than Ramchandra, because he is the one who is actually willing to stake even his own status within his community to unite Puro's relative and her brother. So basically, it's the in the final analysis, one does see that um, it begins with this Rama Ravana allegory for sure, but the film sort of tries to go beyond it and represent Rashid as a bad Muslim turned into a good Muslim. It takes on this trope of Hindi films have always taken this trope of good Muslim, bad Muslim. So they pit a good Muslim against a bad Muslim. That's the representational sort of fight or the battle that they posit on screen, because that's what gives them the eyeballs, that's what gets them the audiences. That's exactly what's also happening on the television, on TV screens right these days. So yeah, so the film also does this. It picks on these commercial tropes of a good Muslim, bad Muslim, and tries to extrapolate it against the Rama Ravana allegory, and in a way then presents Rashid at the end of the film as some sort of a antagonist turned protagonist. So yeah, maybe he's just moved from being Ravana, like a pure evil, to being somebody who can be redeemed and who can be seen as someone who has sort of redeemed himself.
Another speaker, madam, thank you very much for that response. Another speaker, participant Ananya Bhattacharjee, she asked this question: do you think that analyzing the decisions taken by female protagonist of Pinjar needs to be looked upon from a standpoint, feminist perspective, as talked about by Rajeshwari Sundar Rajan?
Yes, I did have a look. I have had a look at Rajeshwari Sundarajan's arguments, and I feel that the decisions taken by the females in the film Pinjar takes on a kind of um, a delayed. It basically has a delayed sort of progression. At some point in the film, as I said in my paper as well, the female is seen as having given up hopes of return, but the moment she gives up hopes for return, she is then she is then represented as someone who has acquired certain amounts of strength that were not seen in her. So when she makes that temporal shift from being Puro to being Hamida, she acquires a certain kind of strength. So I would say that the way the film is representing this temporal shift from Puro to Hamida is the point at which the whole sort of ambivalence regarding the character's actual decision making powers is taking a shift from being someone who's to being someone who can make her own decisions at the end of the film, and she decides to stay with Rashid. She decides to stay with the man who abducted her. So at the end of the day, she's making a decision, but it is leading up from several other small decisions that she makes after making that shift from Puro to Hamida.
Okay, madam. Another question that I can see, that is from Chetna Karnani. She asks,
Mhm.
madam, how do you see the working of silences in Khamosh Pani? Do you think silences are Aisha's strength to live her converted life?
Yes, Khamosh Pani is a very interesting film. And one of the things that is interesting in Khamosh Pani is the whole play that Sabiha Sumar makes with long drawn out silences, and the fact that Aisha decides to refuse to discuss her past even with her son. So the son is completely oblivious to the fact that his mother was originally a Sikh woman who had gone through trauma, sexual trauma during partition, and now she is a Muslim widow who is, of course, his mom and things like that. But um, that is another that is a representational trope that is very, very effective in conveying the pain and pathos of a character like Aisha's. Even in the sequence where she has finally decided to end her life by jumping into the well at the end of the film. The entire sequence, I mean, the moment that she's deciding to jump into the well, she says nothing. There is this long, drawn out silence that sort of accompanies that act of hers at the end of the film. So I think it's another character. It's all the silences in the film become another character that basically support Aisha or give her this iconic halo, as I said in my paper.
Okay. Okay. Even though that is another question that is a bit, not related to your uh, lecture, but there is a question from Sujita Das who is asking, what is your take on the portrayal of women in recent web series? So I don't know whether
Ah,
you're watching web series or not.
yes, I am. I am watching web series.
Yes, yes. Now,
Well,
what about the
it
portrayal?
depends. I don't know which web series the questioner is actually focusing
Asking,
on
yeah.
this.
She has not mentioned it.
Yeah, but then I think there is, for example, let me start off the answer with an example. There is a web series called Made in Heaven. I think the person who asked the question would know this. Made in Heaven is an interesting web series. Firstly, it is one of the it is one of the rather bold portrayals of homosexual men in urban India. Secondly, it portrays urban Indian women with which again is a more contemporary and a more modern representation of urban Indian women than we have ever seen on commercial cinema. So the web series, has, because it is sort of, it doesn't get, there is no censorship in web series until now. We are basically seeing a more nuanced portrayal of women characters. For instance, in the series called Made in Heaven, there is a young woman who is unapologetic about the ways and means she uses to get ahead in life, right? Um, there is another woman who is, of course, having psychological problems, but she's not afraid to discuss these psychological problems with her friends and with people who matter to her. So these are, at the 10 years ago we would not have a woman discussing psychological problems on screen. She would, this kind of a character would be seen as someone who would be immediately removed and put in a mental asylum or something like that. So there are several new trends that are emerging, and the web series gives these kind of portrayals a platform, because like I said, there is no censorship as yet, and I hope there will be no censorship in the future as well. um, Sacred Games, for example, it did not have many women characters, and it did not have women characters with very significant roles, but whatever picture, whatever sort of screen space that women had in the series, it made an impact. It showed a face of urban Indian women, which is essentially not seen before. There is another series called She. There's a web series on Netflix called She, about a woman a police officer who actually disguises herself as a prostitute to catch a gangster. Interesting concept. I do not think a commercial Hindi film would use this, use
Yes.
something like this. And
Yeah, yeah.
and the reason why the web series is a good platform for such kind of portrayals and such kind of experiments, I would say, is because it is completely uncensored. And I hope it remains like this, because then we get all these interesting things to watch.
Yeah, uninhibited. Even, uninhibited.
Uninhibited.
And
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Yeah, Naina Yasmin, she is asking this question. Puro has accepted her fate as it was, but she fought for the right of other women. What is your take on this? Is Rashid to be blamed for Puro's fate?
Well, I think there is a certain amount of blame that the film is ascribing to Rashid because he's the one who basically abducts her. But the transformation of Rashid from a mere abductor into someone who actually stands by Puro as a rock at the end of the film is something that the film is also representing, and that is also something that we must consider. And Puro's decision to help her female relative is again coming from it, like I said before, it is arising from this shift that her character makes from being a weak woman to a strong-willed person who makes her own decisions. Also regarding the child, there is a particular storyline in the film where they sort of adopt a child, but it is taken away because the villagers think that it is a Hindu and they are Muslim and therefore they cannot raise it, and so on and so forth. But Puro is vehement in her stand about keeping the child, and it's only because of the pressure from the village panchayat that she has to give the child up. So that is another sequence, another part of the film that gives her this kind of a heroine like quality. So the at the end of the film, you see Puro as some sort of an avenging angel for the female relative. But because Rashid has been so supportive of her and stood by her throughout the film, she decides to stay with him. So my earlier point about there was no agency to all the women who were later repatriated, and in the arrangement between India and Pakistan, where the abducted women or missing women were brought back to their communities and families, the agency of the woman was not considered at all. So that is also the one point that the film is picking on. Apart from all the other tropes about being bangle sellers, trying to look for women, and so on and so forth, that is another trope that they're trying to pick on. That where is the agency of the woman when this arrangement is thought of? There is no agency. There were some women who actually married their abductors and decided to stay back. So Puro is one of those women who exerts her agency at the end of the day and decides to stay with her abductor, who is now her husband, and who has also atoned for his deed. Through the film, you see him like a breakdown as a person, and when he breaks down as a person, he is atoning for what he did to this woman. And it sort of resolves again, John Cavalry's theory, but the whole thing has to resolve in a very, very, at the end of the day, it has to resolve somehow. So commercial cinema is resolving it. So theoretically, it may sound that a bit bizarre that why would she decide to stay with her abductor? But at the end of the day, you have to see that, they are building it up to that resolution.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, madam. Another question, even though that is not related once again with your topic, but I think it's
Mhm.
a general sort of question, and sought from an intellectual writer like that, from
Mhm.
Sajid Anwar, who is asking, how can we come up with the solution of, for female subjugation, operation, and suppression? Your views.
Sorry, what is the question again? How can I come up with a solution?
Solution for the problems of female subjugation, operation, and suppression.
Ah, I see. Um, the first thing that we have to do is think beyond the superstructure of patriarchy. The moment that if we don't start thinking beyond this, the entire edifice of our patriarchal societies that we are all part of, there is going to be no solution to the problems of women's subjugation and exploitation. This will continue to be, the whole idea of seeing the woman's body as a battlefield for the nation is something that again denies the woman any agency. Who decides that a woman's body is a battlefield? The men are deciding that a woman's body is a battlefield, denying all agency to the woman. So until this edifice is broken down, somehow, or the women, there is some door that opens from this sort of superstructure for the women to emerge out of. It's very difficult to see a comprehensive solution against it. Again, it is difficult to also answer it comprehensively, because there are contextual issues, there are regional variations to all these issues that we're talking about, there are cultural problems, there are cultural contexts to uh, issues, issues of women's empowerment, issues of women's exploitation, issues of women being subjugated. But in general, most patriarchal societies have subjugated women and have denied them access. So once this the patriarchal structure starts getting loosened or starts getting broken down, that's when a solution will start to emerge for the several hundreds of problems that women face every single day in every single society, not just South Asia but all over the world.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your patient sort of answering all those questions. Lots of
No worries.
questions still are coming up. Some are wanting to get your number and all that. Yeah,
Okay.
but I must uh, I must put this question because I find this is pretty interesting. How do you correlate the portrayal of women before independence and after independence, and share it with the films that you have mentioned? One Rajiv Majumdar, a student, I believe.
Okay. So the films that I have been looking at or studying that represent women before independence. One film that I would like to mention is a film called Raj Kahini in Bangla. I
Yes,
don't know if you know of the film. It was
yes.
directed by Sridhar Mukherjee, and
Yeah, yeah.
then a Hindi adaptation of it was made called
Vidyavalan.
Begum Jaan.
Hmm.
Vidya Balan, yes, Begum
Yeah,
Jan. So
yeah.
basically, the film is looking at this question of fallen women, like prostitutes, and what
Hmm.
happens to them. Do they have any agency to decide which side of the border are they going to go to? That is one film that is interesting to look at in terms of our question of partition, our theme of partition, and the fact that pre-independence, how are the women portrayed, and what is changing after independence. So the Pinjar also portrays a woman, the situation prior to independence, and the situation in the post-independence period would be, let me take the example of a film like Padmavat, which is a recent film. And Padmavat is looking at the character of Rani Padmavati, who is a medieval queen. So this is something that that probably is that best exemplifies the question. A medieval queen being portrayed by a contemporary filmmaker, uh, trying to be true to current political trends. So he's trying to portray a certain kind of characters in this film as the suicide of Rani Padmavati here in this film is being hailed as some kind of a sacrifice. Well, and one argument is, of course, that it was a supreme sacrifice. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to kill yourself or to sacrifice yourself in the way that she did. But on the other hand, there is also the whole argument about what agency did Rani Padmavati have in deciding to make that sacrifice? Who decided for her that this is the way in which she will protect her honor and that of her clan? Again, the question of agency, as I was just telling you. I mean, uh, throughout Pinjar, throughout the whole process of repatriating or bringing back women, there was women who had no agency. Similarly, in Padmavat, did we ever think about what agency Padmavati had in doing what she did? Or she was only following protocol? If she was only following protocol, then who makes these protocols? And of course, it is, the whole superstructure of patriarchy that has been subjugating and enslaving in many ways women in traditions and customs that are completely antithetical to the rights of a woman,
Yes,
um,
exactly.
but are seen as, of course, as something that is seen as a supreme sacrifice, or seen as some sort of a, like a great deed that the woman committed, and therefore the woman is then hailed as a heroine. So on the one hand, you create a situation where that is probably the only thing that the woman would do, and on the other hand, then you hail her as a heroine. So there is a contradiction there, and the agency of the woman, of course, is not considered at all. So, in most films that deal with pre-partition, post-partition, pre-independence, post-independence portrayals of women, this is something that runs throughout these narratives.
Okay. Thank you very much, madam. And you have faced a lot of questions. Thank you very much for giving them the answers. Also, they all are pleased, as I can see from their responses. It has been really an enriching experience talking with you also and listening to your lecture, your presentation. There is a hell
Thank you.
of a lot to learn from you. Lots of students are there. They must have learned a lot of things from your presentation, and it has been excellent. We are really grateful that you have come up to this podium, and wholeheartedly thank you and wishing all the best for your future, and do take care, madam.
Thank you so much, Professor Sen. Thank you for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Namaskar. Yes.
Okay, now the next the fantastic speech that we have learned from Dr. Roshni Sengupta is over. And right now, we'll be moving on to our last speaker, and for whom we had been waiting for so long, that is Professor Himadri Lahiri, a stalwart in this part of the world in Department of English. And sir has been very kind that he has given us his consent to attend this. Professor Himadri Lahiri is currently professor of English at the School of Humanities, Netaji Subhas Open University, Kolkata. He is a former professor, Department of English and Culture Studies, University of Bardhaman, West Bengal. He has written extensively on diaspora uh, studies, then post-colonial studies, Indian English literature, and partition studies. So his latest book is Diaspora Theory and Transnationalism. It has been published from Orient Black Swan in the year 2019. And he has recently also co-edited 2 volumes, Revisiting Partition and Bangladesh Liberation War, uh, that is contemporary perspectives, published from Akhand publication, New Delhi, 2020, and contemporary Indian English poetry and drama, that is Newcastle on Tyne, Cambridge Scholars, 2019. So he writes books, reviews for newspapers and academic journals also, and we are very glad to have you on the platform, sir. And here we are actually, waiting for long when sir would be coming, and he'll be giving us his valuable lecture. So it is over to you, sir. Professor Himadri Lahiri, who has been former professor of English in the Department of English in University of Bardhaman. Thank you very much once again, sir. It is over to you right now for your lecture, for your presentation.
Thank you so much. First of all, I must thank the Department of English, Netaji Subhas Mahavidyalaya, and you see especially 2 of my colleagues over there, and I'm very grateful to them for inviting me today. You know that I am not actually partition specialist, but I've done some studies, and I will try to give my opinions on certain things, on certain aspects of partition, from my own point of view. You see that my main point is that the topic of today's topic is that partition studies recent trends, and the basic thesis is that that we have moved a long way from how we started immediately after the partition and where we traveled. I want to have some kind of configuration of the trajectories of partition studies and partition writings as a whole. Okay, I have PPT to share, so let me share that. And whether I'm technologically a bit challenged, let me see whether it is successful. Will you allow streamyard.com to see your screen? I want to allow, but it's not going. Huh? Just
Yes, sir. If you want to share your screen, you'll have to definitely allow StreamYard to share your screen, sir.
it's not allowing me to allow. Just a minute. StreamYard kit. Is it visible? Is it visible now?
Yes, sir, it is visible. Kindly allow. Yes, sir. Kindly share your
So
slideshow.
So am I to do anything more like now? Slideshow for again.
Yes, sir, you'll have to, yes, slideshow, please.
Is it okay? Is it okay?
It's not okay. Sir, it is not okay.
No, sir.
Oh.
The whole screen can't be seen.
Is it okay now? No.
Yes. Yes. Right now it is okay, sir.
Okay. Okay. So,
Yes, sir. Please share your slideshow, sir.
sure.
Just put a click on the slide, sir.
Huh?
Yes. Yes, that's like. Just put a click on the slides.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, it's fine, sir. Right now it is good. You can see it.
Okay. So, you know that as I told you that my focus is basically on the trajectory of the partition studies that we have gone so far. I shall like to begin that right from the partition, how the partition stories, how the partition fictions actually moved, developed, and from our own position right now, which is 2020, as you know, how can we see the entire scenario of development? That is my point of view. It's a big one, but I shall actually focus on the latest kind of happenings, latest kind of trends that we can come across. Okay? So you see that what we'll be talking about is actually the afterlife of partition of India. Uh, you know that partition was a kind of traumatic event about which all of us have talked about, and I am very much grateful to my two of my earlier speakers who in a very pointed manner from two perspectives gave us some background of the representation of the partitioned lives during the in films basically. So the point is that we had our partition in 1947, but the partition is endless. Right now we have series of partitions in the lives of the people of the subcontinent. Not only in India, but also Bangladesh and Pakistan, we have in some form or other continued to experience the kinds of experience that we had experienced during the 1947 and immediately before and after the incident. You know that the Wazira Zamindar, whom Gautam has already mentioned earlier, he has actually Zamindar has called the partition a long partition, which has thrust upon the post-colonial states to perform the unfinished task of the political partition. So the partition was political. The 1947 partition was political. But then you see the political partition, which was the decision of the political leaders, but the sufferers were the common people of the subcontinent. So even when the partition was achieved, when the India became independent or Pakistan became independent, the assignments which were imposed upon the post-partition states was not finished. So the states had to grapple with the problem of partition, the problems that left behind by the partition, the phenomenon which we know as the partition itself. Now, Yasmin Khan also calls this a prolonged partition. You see that critics and the historians and the creative writers, they all agree on this, that this partition, the after effect of partition, the afterlife of partition, they continue even now. And this prolonged partition carried out through disputes over citizenship and socio-political belonging. So the question of the citizenship is even a live issue now, as you all know. And the question of belonging to the home nation, belonging to, you do not even know which is your home nation. It is true for many of the people who are stateless right now. So from that point of view, in the three subcontinental states, the pangs of partition, the agonies of partition are going on in some way or other. So partition continues to affect us in various ways, and it is affecting us not only politically, but also personally. We suffer individually as well. And that is why you see that Ananya Jahanara Kabir feels the need for reading 1971 when Bangladesh became independent, along with 1947. So in a way, the Bangladesh Liberation War is connected with the partition itself. So it continues continues even now, and Bangladesh war was in a way the result of the 1947 partition. So we can see all these developments in the nations of the subcontinent in an interconnected way. And in the case of later generations, you will find that the entire history of these connections is not completely known, as I shall come upon the point later on. You see that Chiranjit Man and Anne Murphy, they also feel that the years 1971, 1984, 2002, these are the later two dates are something when actually Indira Gandhi was assassinated and anti-Sikh riots took place, and 2002 was the Godhra riot year. So all these are connected in some way or other by the critics, and these dates, these 3 years particularly, they open up the memories of the past. Okay, this was said in Partition and the Practice of Memory. The book was called like that. And from that point of view, you see that partition left a trail of incidents, trail of emotions, trails of political emotions and political passion that resulted in the happenings, political and social happenings of the nations. And that is why the continuation of the partition is a potent force, and we do not know where we shall go from 1947 partition. Immediately after the partition, as you know, the partition studies at that time in the
Sir,
1940s.
Yes.
Excuse me, sir. Please.
Sir,
I can't be heard.
Yes, sir. You please, reduce the volume, sir.
Okay.
No, you are being heard, but it is creating echoes from your part.
Okay.
Just reduce the volume, sir.
Just a minute. Is it okay now? Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Is the sound okay?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sir. It's fine. Fine. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Your sound is fine, sir.
Okay. Okay. So,
carry on, sir.
Just a minute. এটা আবার গোলমাল করে দিয়েছি।
So you are having a problem with the slideshow, sir. Slideshow, there's a problem.
Is it okay now? Slideshow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. It's okay now.
So, the partition, as you know, in the 1940s and 1950s, as you know, even in 1960s, there were not much corpus of the partition, books on partition, studies on partition. There were not much novels and short stories. So you see that right from 1960s, actually the process of writing on partition, the trauma of partition started. And in the initial phases, as you know, the focus was on the humanitarian issues. The trauma was the most important aspect of the partition studies. The novels and the short stories and other kinds of critical writings, they were concerned with how people underwent trauma, and therefore the personal lives and the community lives, the problems of the displacement and the problems of the loss of home, these became the overriding concerns in the representations. And therefore, the point of view was liberal, the ideology was basically humanitarian, and you will find evidence of that in novels like Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, which actually represents the interfaith rivalries, inter-religious rivalries, and how the passions, the radical passions, they snowballed into kind of communalism. And that is the topic of the novel. You have a wonderful novel, which is called a wonderful short story, which is called A Thorn in the Path. It is written by Ramesh Chandra Sen, and in this Bengali story, what happens is that the trauma of displacement, the trauma of migration is being projected. It was written early, and therefore you see the focus, the foregrounding was that of the trauma and that of the migration itself. So the characters, the main characters, which is the male character, which is leading his family, leaving the house in what is called Bangladesh now, and he's traveling towards, migrating towards what is now known as West Bengal now. They are moving and leaving their homes and hearth behind, and they are very much traumatic, and there is the sufferings on the way. And the story, as you know, in Bengali was known as Pothir Kanta. Okay? Parashar initially was so much traumatic, so much tension-ridden, that he constantly rebuked his wife and his son. The son was running fever, and therefore it was creating problems for forward movement. They were very much apprehensive that Ansars, who were a group of people, Muslim people, who went on robbery, who robbed the migrants on their way to West Bengal, these Ansars may come and they might rob them and even kill them. So it was a tension-ridden journey, and initially the son was considered to be thorn, but later on you see the young, the head of the family, Parashar, he picked up a young child who was suckling the breasts of the dead mother who lay dead on the way. And you see that young mother, that mother might be a victim of cholera. So should he take up the child with him? This was the fundamental question. And he ultimately decided to take up the child, although his wife was not at all happy with him. So what this short story actually represents is the humanitarian concern of a common man who was earlier rebuking his wife and child for doing all kinds of works which were sympathetic to other co-travelers. So from that point of view, the migration was an experience of transformation. This short story is a representative short story, and this short story ultimately shows how the earlier writers actually concentrated on the themes of humanitarianism. And this story has been wonderfully, very effectively analyzed by Devasri Bosu in her article of Travels and Travels, Partition Migration in Ramesh Chandra Sen's A Thorn in the Path. And I have already talked about the trauma in Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, and you have found, you know of many stories of Manto, who, for example, the story Open It. You know what kind of trauma the father figure was going. He was not concerned at all that his daughter was raped. He was very happy that his daughter was alive. And therefore, you see that these early writings were basically about humanitarianism. But then you will find from 1980s onwards certain kind of shift in tone. Although the humanitarian concern went side by side, but ultimately you see the writers were talking about other themes in a fashion which was not seen earlier. So, technically speaking, strategically from the representational strategy, you see the authors were taking up much more specific standpoints. The authors were taking up ideologically specific location, and from that location, from those locations, they were moving towards representation of the common people. So you see, ultimately, the concern was not that of what the political leaders said or did. The concern was how the common people suffered during and immediately after the partition. And when you think of Amitabh Ghosh's Shadow Lines, you will find that these two streams continue side by side. On the one hand, there is Thamma, and Thamma is a wonderful character who represents the older generation who had witnessed, although not directly because she was not there in Dhaka at that time, she was in Calcutta at that time. But in the meantime, when she was in a job in Calcutta, what happened? The partition happened, and therefore she couldn't go back to her home, what she knew as home. So the trauma was there, and Thamma therefore represents the older generation who suffered, who knew what partition meant, and side by side, Ghosh also represents the newer generations who were not familiar with the partition because they didn't suffer directly, because they came later, and they have ideas about partition. They hear the stories of partition from the mouths of the earlier generation, from Thamma, for example. So you see, although the Shadow Lines was written in 1998, the telling of the story from the point of view of a young anonymous writer, anonymous speaker, is very important, because while telling the story, the young narrator was very much influenced by Tridip, and Tridip, as you know, was an internationalist who didn't believe in the short, closer bounded spaces like a nation. So you see that the young narrator was very much influenced by the Tridip, and therefore the young boy very questioningly was considering whatever Thamma was saying. So in the story, in the theme of the novel, you find two streams going side by side: the sufferings of Thamma, who had lost home, and also the questioning attitude and the internationalist attitude of the second or the third generations of the narrators. So this is a very interesting kind of the story, which was published in 1991. So right from the 1980s, the things began to change. And if you look at another story, Joginder Pal's Sleepwalkers, which is a wonderful story about a mad man who moved from, it is also a story of migration, but how the people took the migration. These people were considered in Pakistan, Karachi, as a Muhajirs. The first generation of people had some problems about acclimatization, and the main character became an insane person. So this insane person thought that he had never moved away from Lucknow. So he made Karachi spatially Lucknow. So there was no change for him. So in the partition narratives, you will find a plethora of mad characters, and the mad characters, like the characters of young narrators like Lilia in Ice Candy Man, or the young narrator in the shadow lines, or the young girl narrator in Jhumpa Lahiri stories. When Mr. Pirzada came to dine, all these have young narrators. So young narrators is a category of speakers, category of narrators, and on the other hand, you have characters like you see the mad persons. There are quite a good number of mad persons. Toba Tek Singh is one. There are a good number of mad characters in the partition narratives. You may ask yourself, why is it that these characters, there are so many mad characters, and why is it that the narration is often conducted through young narrators? These are very important questions, and these can be found. The answers can be found only after after careful introspections. You know that mad persons are rather, the insane persons are more sane than the saner persons. That is one attitude that the writers have adopted, because they do not have any kind of egocentric, prejudiced way of seeing the interpersonal and intercommunity relationships. So when the saner people, so-called saner people, went on breaking the nations, these mad persons began to question, why is it that the nations should be broken? Why is it that I have to leave my own home? And what would be the concept of home if I get displaced? So you see, displacement and the resultant questions, they cropped up in the novels and short stories that we come across immediately after the partitions, for the writers who wrote in the 1960s, those who wrote in the 1970s. But from 1980s, you will find some kind of changes in the representation. You see that I will bring another dimension to my talk. You see that I have talked about the generations. I've talked about the first generation who suffered, who went through the experiences. I have also talked about the second and the third generations. The second and the third generations may not be so much involved with the question of partition. They were moving away from the actual phenomenon, and it was for them a secondary tale told by the first generation people. So there was some kind of amnesia, there was some kind of forgetfulness, and whatever was remembered was remembered through the memories of the first generation people. But you see that the stakeholders in the partition was not only the Indians and the Bangladeshis and the Pakistanis, but the stakeholder in one sense was also the colonial government, the colonial British government. And the British government, actually, it is because of them, it is because of their encouragement that India was partitioned. So what is the attitude in Britain today? So I am trying to come back to the present moment, because partition studies have gone through moments, historical moments, and every moment is important because every moment has witnessed the paradigm shifts of some kind or other. So I want to see the partition studies today from today's perspective, from today's point of view. And when we see, just today I received a mail from 1947 partition archive, and there was some interesting information there. And these are the information that the British people, they are innocent of what happened during the partition. They do not know much about the partition, although their ancestors were responsible, though they were the colonizers and they were responsible of the partition. And I will read out some portions of the letter that I received today. Surveys suggest 44% of the Britons are proud of Britain's history of colonialism. Most, however, are unaware of events such as partition and Bengal famine. Okay, this is one very important point. Now, what what are the persons doing? What are the activists doing over there? Binita Kane, founder of the Partition Commemoration Campaign in the United Kingdom, with the help of Amina Malak and Raj Answorth, has also launched the Partition Education Group to educate Britons on world-changing colonial impacts such as the partition of British India. So you see, so-called civilized nations who were responsible for colonial divisions, the descendants of those colonial administrators and rulers, they are innocent about what happened in 1947 and later. And therefore, you see, the problem lies not only in our own nations, subcontinental nations, but the problem lies in Britain as well. That is why the activists like Binita Kane and Amina Malak and Raj Answorth, they are very much, they have launched programs. They are very much concerned about what can be done to educate the Britons about this history, because they are also suffering from amnesia, as the recent generations are suffering in India or Bangladesh or Pakistan. So what they will do is that they will participate in an interactive conversation on July 12, 2020, and this will be streamed live via Facebook at under the initiative of 1947 Partition Archive. So this is a kind of development that is taking place both in England and also in India. And this is an amnesia that is worth studying. Why is it that, especially for us, why is it that we are embracing amnesia much more closely than the first generation? The first generation was not amnesic. Even if they wanted to forget the traumatic experiences, they could not. Many of them actually did not reveal what they suffered. But then, due to the efforts of the later activists and researchers, many of those events, many of the phenomena came to the foreground. And I can mention here Urvashi Bhutalia's efforts or Ritu Menon's efforts, and this has been discussed earlier as well. But what is important for us is that we are remembering partition belatedly. And when I say belatedly, I am very fond of talking about belatedness, because belatedness is actually, it has an underpinning, an ideological underpinning. Belatedness is something, you have a timing gap between the event that took place and where you stand today. So it is more than 70 years right now, and we are looking back, and we are looking back belatedly. And as a result of this belated looking back, what we are doing, we are remembering many things which the first generation people did not remember. So from that point of view, you see, the belatedness is a kind of anamnesia. As you know, anamnesia is a recall of the past events, and it is an attempt to swipe away the amnesia that has gripped us. This is a post-colonial project, and this is a post-colonial project for the retrieval of memory. When I talk about belatedness, I obviously remember the contributions, the theoretical contributions of Freud, and of course another later critic, Iranian critic, an Iranian expatriate critic, Ali Behdad, who actually talked about belatedness as a kind of post-colonial project, a kind of anamnesic project that brings out the hidden treasures or hidden facts and figures. Otherwise, unless there is belated looking back, it would have remained hidden forever. So, as you know, the kind of amnesia that is sweeping in the post-colonial India because of the emergence of new generations who may not be so much concerned about partition and the effects of partition, who have moved away from partition and the effects of partition. The affective effect is not so much there, and the history of emotion is not much available to them, and therefore what is happening is that they are concerned more about the business of life. When I say this, I obviously refer to Urvashi Bhutalia's book, which came out later, some 3 or 4 years back, which is edited by him, and the title of the book is Partition, the Long Shadow. So you see, the long partition, the image of the long partition continues. And The Long Shadow is a wonderful book which talks about the anamnesic efforts. Okay, this book was published in 2015, and this book actually talks about the generational change. It has 2 focal points in the book. As Urvashi maintains in the introduction, the book is written with twin purpose in mind. One is that there are changes of generations, and the second, third, fourth generations, they are more concerned with how to go on living today in a meaningful way rather than to look back to partition in an affective way. This is one kind of mentality that the present generations have. And the second point that Urvashi Bhutalia was concerned with, there were areas, for example, Ladakh or Kashmir, about which the partition has not been talked about much. So in this book, there is an article on Ladakh, there is an article on Assam, there is an article on Kashmir. These are the areas where partition studies reached late. Okay, so from that point of view, this book is a very important intervention in the partition study. Therefore, I talked earlier that there is there in every historical moments. You see, it was published in 2015, and when she looks back with a particular paradigm in mind, particular vision in mind. So she was also concerned about anamnesia, which means the bringing back of memory. It is a post-colonial project, as I said. So her earlier project actually brought out the stories of women who did not talk, who didn't want to talk. So how they went through the trauma. It is because of her painstaking efforts that she went on years after years, and she built up relationships. She visited women of different generations, earlier generations particularly, and how she brought out the stories that they wanted to tell to the world. And in the process, Urvashi Bhutalia was concerned with an ethical point as well. She ruminates in the introduction of the other side of partition, other side of silence, about whether she should at all tell the stories, because many of the women might not have been willing to reveal their stories. So how to tackle this question methodologically? So that was how she was concerned about partition, and the ethical dimension, the moralistic dimension of partition studies also comes out through the earlier studies, the other side of silence. So this is the point, that it is against the amnesia that the descendants of the partition survivors are fighting. So on the one hand, there are generations who are immersed in amnesia, and both in India and, and Britain, and there are people, activists themselves, who are trying their best to so that these people do not forget. Okay. On the other hand, there are groups of people who want the things that are never told, which are very difficult to find out, which lie under the debris of partition, which lie under the debris of history, how to bring them back. They are not easily available because the mainstream archives do not cater to them. What about the stories of the people? For which you need to employ the citizen historians. So the citizen historian is a new concept. So the responsibility is handed over to the newer breeds of historians who may not be trained as historians from the disciplinary point of view, but who are given the responsibilities, who can approach the families much more easily because they can approach their mothers, their grandmothers, their uncles and aunts, so, and the neighbors and the people they know much more easily than the historians may be interested in. So the mainstream historians did not tell about the history of the common people. So there was a great paradigm shift, and the responsibility of telling the stories, not only in writing but also through oral mediums, shifted from the mainstream historians who believe in writing to the historians who are also exploring other alternative ways of talking about partition. So you see, the belated net has given rise to new kinds of insights into the partition stories. So the belated attempts at representing partition, have come from the very pointed locations, very ideologically pointed locations. They have, for example, trying to explore the stories of partition from ethno-religious perspectives. For example, you know of the Percy perspective. You know very well about the Bakshi Sidhua's Ice Candy Man, which was published in 1980. And you also are aware of Sindhi narratives. For example, Meera Chand's House of the Sun, which was published in 1989, and Rita Kothari's edited book, Unbordered Memories, Sindhi Stories of Partition, 2009. So you see, from the 1980s, this kind of specific studies of specific groups, studies of groups who are ethnically different, who might be religiously different, and therefore there are writers who belonged to those faiths, religious groups, or religious ideologies. They try to tell their own stories from their own perspectives, and that is why we find the story of Ice Candy Man. And it is a story, and partition studies is not only intergenerational aspects, it has also interdisciplinary aspects. And that is why we should approach the partition novels and partition narratives, including the films, from interdisciplinary points of view, from gender points of view, from feminist points of view, from post-colonial points of view, as I have done just recently, that's just now. So you see that these are the points of views that were very much important. And as I have told you, the narrator in Bakshi Sidhua's story, Ice Candy Man, is an innocent narrator who will not censor even the smallest details that comes under her view. So her gaze is all inclusive. Her gaze is not partial or communitarian. Therefore, you see that she has her own location in a particular religion. She has that particular Parsi background, but then she explores the stories that was evolving around her from the point of view of all the categories, all the religious communities. And the person, the main victim, Aya, she was a Hindu who was victimized by, as you know, a Muslim. So she actually describes in a very clear-cut term, how the tension was brewing immediately after the partition and what happened during and after the partition. So this is a very important point, that because I want to point out that there was a shift, there was a paradigm shift. Now, the gender perspective also, this is very important. I again shall not go into details, but there are wonderful stories, wonderful narratives like Bakshi Sidhwa's Defend Yourself Against Me, which is a small narrative, not a novel itself, but like a short story, big short story. Or Manju Kapoor's Difficult Daughters, or Shona Singh Baldwin's What the Body Remembers. There was specifically in the 1990s an emergence of the gender perspectives from the feminist perspectives. And I shall just say two or three, dwell on Defend Yourself Against Me for 2 to 3 minutes, because it is a wonderful story. It is the story of a Muslim woman who was abducted by Sikh neighbors, and was raped and was sold in the marketplace at the cost of rupees 4 and 5 and 6. So all these things, all these bargainings were going in the public spaces, and this traumatic experience was etched in permanently in her mind. The story then moves on to America after decades, and when this lady went to America to visit her son, and there she meets two young Sikh who were courting two girls in the family who belonged to their family. They were Muslim girls being courted in the neutral space of diaspora by two Sikh women. And when they came to the lady, they met the lady. The lady was moved semiotically by the dresses of these two persons, who were dressed in a chic way and who had their pagris, their headgears, and immediately semiotically she moved back in time, and she remembered how the Sikh people actually tortured her. So then she burst into anger, and she became temporarily an insane person. And she said, I cannot excuse you, I cannot pardon you. Although the two Sikhs lay prostrate before in front of her, and they caught her legs and said, please pardon us for the sins that our forefathers did. So you also notice here two perspectives, the generational perspective, intergenerational perspectives, and also the diasporic perspective. That also became very important perspective here. And ultimately, the lady, after quite some time, came back to herself, and she actually forgave them. Okay, and she said, I forgive you, and I forgive your forefathers long ago, because otherwise, how should I live? This is an example of forgiveness, an unconditional forgiveness that is spoken about by Derrida. Okay, so you find that forgiveness is a quality, and without this quality, as the theoreticians speak, that you cannot move on in life. She moved on in life because of the forgiveness. If she couldn't forgive, she would have been a mad woman, an insane woman. And therefore, you see, the insanity, she was saved from insanity because of her internal negotiation with the event of the past, what went during the partition. Now, I will just point out a very interesting kind of development in the paradigm shifts. You know that you come across so many mad characters, insane characters, characters who are depressed, who were depressed. And therefore, but interestingly, you see, you do not have any book from psychoanalytical perspective. That is a very interesting kind of a development, an incident. So, from that point of view, you see that there was a big gap. But then in 2018, a book was edited by Sanjeev Jain and Alok Sarain, who were by profession psychoanalysts. They were psychiatrists. They wrote a book called The Psychological Impact of the Partition of India. And this book actually covered the ground which was never covered for more than 70 years. We will not come across the partition studies being studied from psychoanalytical or psychiatric perspectives. This book continues to draw on literary narratives like Toba Tekshing, and some other short stories that came out very recently in anthologies. Okay, so you see that this is a development, and this development you can see only come across in 2018, just 2 years back, not even 2 years. Okay, so you see the development of these studies from various perspectives. I do not know how much time I have. Can I have 10 minutes or so? So,
Of course, sir, you can. You can take.
Okay. So you see, you find in the poem Bakshi Sidhu's short narrative, Defend Yourself Against Me, one kind of diasporic perspective. I have spoken of the psychiatric perspective, psychoanalytical perspective. And you see, diaspora perspective is further elaborated when Mr. Pirzada came to dine, a short story which is included in her first collection, which came out in late 1990s, okay, where Mr. Pirzada went to the US in connection with the research. He was a botanist, and this story is told from the perspective of a young girl, Americanized young girl, an Indian Bengali girl, who observes Mr. Pirzada and finds no difference, cultural difference, between Mr. Pirzada, who is a Bangladeshi, and who at the time actually the civil war was going on, the war for Bangladeshi independence was going on. So it was not Bangladesh yet, it was East Pakistan. And Lilia's father was saying that Mr. Pirzada is not an Indian. He is an East Pakistani, but this was incomprehensible to the girl narrator because there was so much affinities, cultural affinities between the characters of her parents and Mr. Pirzada, who they say belong to two different countries. And this is incomprehensible to the young girl who cannot find how the culturally similar people can belong to two different nations. So from her perspective, she is criticizing, Jhumpa Lahiri is criticizing the partition. Okay, and the partition is it was a foolhardy decision by the politicians. This is the message that goes on, goes through the story itself. So when Mr. Pirzada came to dine, is a narrative from the perspective of the young girl narrator. And you see, the topic of today's seminar, webinar, is United by Pen. Okay, this is an excellent example of how can unite the two Bengals, the two nations, through the intervention of the pen. As you know, the young girl, child narrator actually sees the citizens of the two different countries in the same terms. They eat with their own hands and do not use forks, and they leave their shoes outside the house. They do not enter there. They talk and discuss so much things in Bengali. So you see, how can they belong to two different nations? That is the question uppermost in her child. So she is learning history. She does not know the history of partition. Okay, as it happened in the case of the Britons, the Bengali descendants of the Indian immigrants. She is innocent about what happened during the 1947, and she is discovering the story through her father's narration. Her father takes help of the map, and she shows the maps of how the maps of India and Pakistan, East Pakistan and West Pakistan, they are represented cartographically through the use of different colors, which suggests semiotically that they belong to two different nation states. So she was coming to understand how they belong to two different nations. She was trying to read the history of the time, and she was actually surprised by the fact that Mr. Pirzada was keeping two times. Her wrist was keeping the American time, while she has a pocket watch which was keeping the East Pakistani time. So she was actually spatio-temporally present in both the times of Bangladesh, times of East Pakistan, and the times of the United States. So this is a wonderful story, and this story is about the afterlife of partition. How the young narrators, how the descendants of the partition survivors, how they are amnesic, how they are not taught the partition, how partition happened, and how they need to learn the lessons of partition. So this is a wonderful story that I wanted to talk about, and I will now shift on to the next point, and I will continue on this point for about 8 to 10 minutes, you see, and this will be my last point actually, connected points. You see that all these things, why is it that Mr. Pirzada and the parents of the young girl narrator were so much intimate? Because they had a history of emotion. Okay, they had the same kind of cultural lineage. They were connected by history through emotions. So unless and until you know the history of emotion, you cannot understand why they came so close to each other despite the boundaries that run between them invisibly, how the people perceive them to be different people despite their similarities of color. So history of emotion is something that we need to tap. And when you read this particular quotation from Stuart Early, who talked about this in an article called The History of Emotion and Emotional History. He says, investigation into the historical nature and experience of the emotion themselves, not simply their social uses, now needs to come center stage. So what he actually emphasizes is that there should be an investigation into the nature of emotion, the historical nature of emotion, the experience of emotion, and we should go back through emotion to the kind of relationships that existed in the past in any context whatsoever. Okay, it may be in the context of Holocaust, it may be in the context of partition, it may be in any context like that. So therefore, this is a point of entry through which we can move into a kind of belonging. So the characters, the three characters, as Jhumpa Lahiri narrates, they had during when they were listening to the news items in the TV, and as the girl narrator describes them from some distance, the three bodies are one body. They merge into one body, and they were listening to what has been happening in Bangladesh and what kind of news is being streamed through the television news items. So you see, that was what the three bodies. That was how the three bodies became one body, and it is a kind of belonging that you cannot forget. So you see, I will now go to a wonderful book by Achal Malhotra, Remnants of Separation, that I shall discuss for some minutes, and I'm quoting here. She is talking about material memory. So it is a kind emotion runs through materials as well. Materials runs through not only through emotional relationship, but also through material objects. And she has done her research on material objects. This is a quotation from her book. Belongings that were taken across the newly created border at the time of partition carry with them the memory of the migration, however subtly, however unexplored. The object thus, a book for example, a religious book for example, or a tagra for example, an ornament for example, the object serves as a catalyst for memory, a trigger for remembering, as well as a portal into the past. So the object is a site of memory. Object is something that triggers memory. The object is something that brings you back to the past. So the object is a very important remnant that should be studied properly. This is how she actually talks about, and this is the book Anchol Mehrotra, Remnants of a Partition, a history of the partition through material memory. And you can see the tagra, the ornament here. This takes the character back into the time of the displacement. The main question is, at the sudden decision that you will leave your home and hearth and go to India or to Pakistan, what will you choose to take with you? What objects will you take with you? And of what objects will remain there back in your original homeland? This is a very difficult decision. And therefore, both the kind of objects will take you back into history, the objects that you have taken along with you, and the objects that you have failed to take along with you. So both kinds of presence and the absence, presence of the object and the absence of the objects, are very valuable kind of objects who will allow you entry into the history of partition. Achal Mitra speaks of breaking away from the traditional approach, complementing it with alternative methods to commemorate those affected by the Great Divide. These are methods of oral history, recording and interviewing, and proved to be remarkable resources, distilling an enormous event down to something that is graspable, the experience of the individual. Memorialization is not a passive practice but an active conversation, and this can be done through material history. And you see that objects cannot be seen just physicality, from the point of physicality, it is present there, but also metaphysicality. And I quote again, archiving the minutiae of movements, the change of in one's facial features, the lifting of voice that accomplishes the narration of the object's history, a grasp, a sigh, the soft stroke of a finger on its surface, on the surface of the object, even a gesture of nonchalance and dismissal became my main aim, she says. So you see the object, how the object is being tackled by the person who possesses the object. So you see, Achal Mehrotra is approaching the history of the object, the material memory, from the history of emotion. How the possessor behaves, how he moves when she shows the object, okay? How the voice changes when she speaks of a particular coat, for example, long coat, for example, or an ornament, for example, or something else which is very valuable to the person. How does a person behave? How does the facial emotions, how do the emotions come out through the facial gestures? These are also things to be properly seen and explored, and Achal Malhotra was doing that. When originally the possessor of the objects, the maliks of the objects, they were not conscious of the value of the objects. But when Achal Mehrotra wants to take them in her hands and says, for example, shall I take this for a few days? Only then the possessor of the objects become highly emotive, and they do not want to part with the objects because they consider these to be very valuable for them. So they do not want to part with the objects, and therefore you see they become very, very important things for them. Now, I have spoken of the history of emotion. I have spoken of the alternative methods of oral history, interviewing, and archiving. I will refer to some archives and what they are doing right now. They are, in fact, bringing about a whole paradigm shift. They are moving away from the mainstream history to the alternative kind of history. They're coming down from the history of the nation, history of the state, political history, to the personal histories, to the private histories, to the histories of the individuals. So from that point of view, you see that archives are coming back. You see, in the probably in 1914 or 15, I'm not sure, the Amritsar archive came. Probably in 1915, the Amritsar archive, partition archive came, and they actually store books, pictures, some oral histories, paintings, etc., etc. Things became much more important when you see the 1947 archive came into being, and they posited lots of oral histories that we are not aware of. So now these oral histories, the kind of things that Ritu Menon, Kamla Bhasin, Urbushi Butalia did, they are coming full circle, and they're coming through the efforts of citizen historians who are moving from house to house, moving to the partition victims, the people who, the generation that is passing away, they are moving away, they are dying like anything. So whatever time there is at hand, the history should be preserved. So the citizen historians are moving from house to house, family to family, and the authorities, the organizers of the partition narratives, partition archives, they are opening up, they are displaying all these things, they are uploading all these things, and you can donate the images because many of these are digital archives. And the institute I am right now associated with, it has a wonderful archive also, which has recently opened. And the particular characteristic of this archive is that it concentrates on the villages which are bordering the India-Pakistan border, and they are targeting people who are 70 or above 70, and these are the people who belong to the lower strata of society. So this project moved away from the cities, mainstream histories, moved away from the stories of the people who are located in the cities, big cities, to the villages, to the rural areas, to the lower class people, Dalits, for example, whose stories have hardly come out. So this digital archive is now open, and you can access this. And this is a kind of archive which will open new chapters in history. You have also Achol Mehrotra's own archive, and you can obviously donate there. So these are the archives which are bringing out a comprehensive history of the partition, and therefore right at the moment history seems to have come full circle. We have moved away from the humanitarian perspectives and the mainstream history telling of histories from the perspectives of nation states and from the perspectives of political histories. We have come down to the population, communities, and individuals, religious communities, and ethnic communities. We have gone out to the diaspora. We have gone out to the many places, and we are bringing out histories in its many manifestations which were previously unimaginable. Thank you very much. I have taken much of your time, I suppose. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. And we were all mesmerized, listening to you. And after a long time, I personally have heard you. It has been a pleasure and really fantastic, insightful session for us. And all the message boxes are full, and they all are eager to ask you lots of questions. Please take the pains to answer some of the very interesting sort of questions, sir. That is, first of all,
Please.
I'd be taking uh, uh, Amrita Mandal. Amrita Mandal, she asks about the question of coming and going. Coming and going in what is that question? What is that concept? Let me find it out, sir.
Coming and going in the shadow lines, sir.
Yeah, in the shadow lines. And the Thamma even does not know what does that mean, what is coming, what is going. So your take on that?
It's a very interesting question, as you know, but this is specifically comprehensible to the Bengali speakers, Bengali, those who understand the language, linguistic aspects of Bengali. When we go to some place, we often say, "Ami bari elam." For example, I come from Bardwan to Kolkata. I say from when I start, I say, "Ami bari ashbo." Or when we come to, so Asha and Jawa, go and come, they are interchanged, they have different connotations in English, but they have totally different connotations in Bengali because they are interchanged, and Amitabh Ghosh very, very effectively utilizes this as a strategy of saying that, coming and going have been entangled in ambiguities in the course of the narratives of partition, because the person who lost home do not know when she goes to Dhaka whether it is a coming or it is a going.
Going. Yes,
Normally
exactly.
in Bengali we say Bari Elam. So it is titled, the entire section is titled Coming Home. Okay, so coming home is a wonderful kind of privilege, is a wonderful kind of pilgrimage for Thamma, for Thakuma, the grandmother. Okay, it is visiting the old house, what she conceived as home. Okay, it is totally another matter that she was frustrated, she was disillusioned because everything has changed in Dhaka, the landscape has changed, and the old signposts are no longer there. Kanubabu's sweet shops are not there. So you
It
see,
takes us to different sort of things. Different, the term is urbanography. Urbanography. Dhaka is changing.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, Dhaka is growing, it is changing, and the old places are swept away. New places are coming up. Old places, therefore, which meant so much for the first generation refugees, first generation partition survivors, for them it is synonymous with home. And as you know, the home is a sacred place. Homing desire is something very much there in their minds. They have nurtured it, and they thought that Dhaka may be home, and they had a homing desire like that. But when she goes up there, she finds that she cannot live there probably, because even though she has homing desire, she doesn't have the home there. Okay, so
Yes.
there is, as you know, Akhtar Bra talks about the difference between the homing desire and home. A homing desire means you have the desire, but home can only be there where you can find the home comfortable. If there is not comfortable, it is not comfortable. It cannot be a home for you. So
Yes.
for Thamma, the home was no longer a home. Okay, she was in search of home, but she was disillusioned. Okay,
Yes.
and that is why, and as you know, Tridip died there in an attack, and therefore what happened? The home space became an uncanny space for her. Okay, it became an uncanny space, unhomely space, and therefore she began to, right from the moment, right from the attack on Tridip, right from the loss of the old road signs. Okay, the home no longer became home, and she became angry, and she began to nurture a hate for the new nation. Okay, and that is why later she sacrificed her gold chain. She donated it to the war fund when the war was going on between India and Pakistan.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
I,
So
I,
Savita Tehlan. Savita Tehlan asking a question which is pretty interesting, I believe. Is the partition trauma a quest for political identity?
will you repeat, please? Is
Is
that
the partition trauma Is the partition trauma a quest for political identity?
I don't think it is just political identity, because, as you know, you're tangled in a political kind of identity mess. Okay, because you are tangled in the shadow lines. Okay, you
Yes.
cannot forget what was your home at one time. Okay, the protagonist of the sleepwalkers cannot forget the space. The place was Lucknow, but she met Karachi in Lucknow. So he was not ready to leave Lucknow. So the Lucknow was traveling with him. Okay. So instead of he traveling, he was really physically traveling to Karachi from Lucknow. But then, in a metaphorical way, Lucknow actually traveled with him. Lucknow traveled to Karachi, and Karachi became Lucknow. Read Joginder Paul's Sleepwalkers. Khwabnama. I think the Urdu novel is a translation. Khwabnama. I'm not sure, but you can see the novel. You can go to the novel, either the original one, those of you who can read Urdu, and the translated version brought out by Kotha. So you go to that and you will find that how the identity, the political identity of the refugees are suspended midway. You do not know whether you belong to East Pakistan or Bangladesh or to India or to America. Lilia, when Mr. Pirzada came to dine, says, when my father pronounces the word dish or country, when my parents say dish, they inevitably meant India. They no longer think of the US as their dish.
Yes.
But Lilia, by contrast, thinks of the US as a dish because of the generation differences and the way she was brought up. Okay, so you see, from political point of view, your identity remains suspended for a long time, and do not know where your identity lies. So I don't think it is a search for political identity. It may be a search. It may be you are going to find, maybe after 30 years or 40 years, you can find you can come to a settlement. You can find that there is a solution after all. But immediately, I don't think the home, the desh, the original identity goes away as soon as you leave your country, leave your original space.
Okay, thank you, sir, for answering that. Another thing, Krishnendu Dasgupta wants to know about amnesia, which is a post-colonial project. And similar to this, Ananda Bhattacharya also talks about amnesia, how to remember the narratives of trauma and pain of the raped women of 71 through amnesia that had been suppressed through governmental attempts of eulogizing them with the tag of Virangona. So amnesia, what is your take on that, sir? Amnesia, a post-colonial project.
I use the term amnesia as a kind of an umbrella term, and you can apply it to different kind of projects, whatever kind of projects that may be. But it is basically a kind of idea that is applied to. It was originally a psychological idea, a kind of idea that belongs to psychiatry or psychology or psychoanalytics field. But then it traveled further from Freud, and it moved to the contemporary times when I was very dependent on Ali Bedad, who has a wonderful book, and I talk about this book in many places. Whenever I talk about amnesia, you see, the Ali Bedad wrote a book called, two books in fact. One is called Belated Travelers, and the other one is called Forgetful Nation. You will find that the concept of forgetfulness is there underneath both the titles. Okay, so forgetfulness is amnesia, and anamnesia, as you know, is the project to bring out to recall whatever has been lost or
Yes.
seemingly lost. Seemingly lost, I use the term seemingly lost because if you dig, you can find out many treasures. Okay?
Yes.
So archaeologically, the silences can be digged into. You do
Yes.
your kind of archaeological
Silences are
digging into
pretty much
silence.
eloquent.
Yeah, and you bring out the kinds of silences that lie. That is why Urvashi Butalia uses the term silence, the other side of silence. Okay,
Other side.
so it is a kind of digging. It is a kind of archaeological digging into the silences, going to there to the other side of where the silence reigns, and it was hard efforts to bring out the narratives which are shrouded in total amnesia. Okay, she did a wonderful job, and she had many of her colleagues who did wonderful jobs. But I think about partitions, the project started from there. Okay, and it continued, and right now the archivists and citizens historians, they are doing it wonderfully, and the digital archive is the site of the blasting the silences. So you see, anamnesia is very much there. And someone referred to the Biranganas, and you are
Birangana,
absolutely
Ananda
right.
Bhattacharya.
They, and you are absolutely right. You know, our keynote speaker had done wonderful jobs there as well. I am not sure whether she talked about that in her keynote speech yesterday, but she
She
had
did
a lot
mention.
of. I think she
She
referred
did
to
mention.
that. I heard for her for 30 minutes or so, but she had done wonderful jobs there. And in Bangladesh, lots of works are going on. So, Biranganas, it was a title given to them by no less a person than Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. So, you see, that was also a project where the post colonial, because for them, as you have heard from the ma'am, it was for them there were apparently three partitions, and 1971 was another kind of a partition. So for
Exactly.
them, it was a kind of a post-colonial situation from where emerged the Biranganas, and therefore the silences cannot be brought out. And Niaz Zaman has anthologized many of the stories, and she's doing therefore wonderful jobs. And therefore, it is a kind of amnesic blast of an amnesic blast of amnesia. No doubt
Okay.
about that.
Sir, last question we should be taking up. Surinder Alam, he asked this question, sir, could you say the similarities of partition literature and diaspora literature in terms of displacement crisis? Surinder Alam.
This is also a very interesting question. I think I do not know how to respond to this. Partition, whether you call partition a kind of a diaspora or not, I'm not sure. There are some critics who definitely call it partition. Okay, but there might be. I personally had some doubts, but I believe that it was also a kind of a diaspora. The problem lies in the fact that partition. What does partition mean? Thamma had her home in Dhaka, which belonged to the same homeland. So originally, you are not moving from one homeland to another homeland. Okay, so when Thamma moved from Dhaka before the partition, he moved from the same nation from Dhaka to Kolkata to Calcutta. So she was moving from the same nation to the same nation. It was not a different nation. So should you call that it was an internal kind of a movement? Should you call that diaspora? I tend to answer no. At the time, it was not a diaspora. But then suddenly diaspora happened that it became a totally new country and huge population. The
Sir,
members of the population.
what about the point of compulsion and wish, personal wish?
And
These two things.
they were coerced into to leave the land. So it was not a deliberate choice. It was a forced choice in the case of the partition. And for diaspora also, there are both coercive and voluntary partitions, movements. If you think of the indentured labor movement in the 19th century and early 20th century, Indian movement, it was totally a kind of a voluntary movement, at least theoretically speaking. They had to sign they had to sign an agreement. Okay, so formally it was a voluntary movement, but it was for all effects. It was a coercive movement because they were forced to, in certain ways, they fell victims to Arcatias. But the new diaspora, post-colonial diasporas from in the post-colonial nation, that is more or less, you see, voluntary, and therefore there is no coercion involved there. So diaspora can both be coercive and voluntary. And in the partition cases, most of the diaspora people moved because of coercion, because of they were forcibly moved, because of the threat perception. So from there is no problem. The problem lies with the homeland. So you see that I tend to think right now that yes, diaspora was also a kind of movement, although it was a coerced movement, a particular kind of a movement. And there are many points of intersections between the two phenomena, diaspora and refugee movement. But then they cannot be actually clearly what shall I grouped into watertight compartments. They are there and they can be used differently as well.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. Wonderful. It has been really, really wonderful. And Professor Jaman is also there, who is telling that I have not referred to 1971 as a third partition. 71 was a consequence of the partition of 1905 and the partition of 1947. So she is very much there, and she has also enjoyed your lecture, sir. Thank you very much for coming to our webinar. It has been really,
Ononna Jahanara Begum, for example, tax 1947 and 1971 together. There are critics like that who have tagged them together, and there are also critics like our keynote speaker, ma'am, Niaz ma'am, who very clearly mentioned that she connected 1905 with 1971.
And 1971. Yes. So, okay, sir, thank you very much. We are, overwhelmed hearing you, and all the, responses are indicating that sort of amazement at your lecture. So once again, sir, heartily thank you very much for coming to our webinar, and hopefully our bond will continue in the future sort of endeavors as well, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Roshka, for everyone.
For the listeners, tomorrow is our last day on 12th January, and it will start at 3 p.m., not at 2 p.m., because you have got some speakers who are in other parts of the world. To accommodate them, we had to shift the timing from 3 p.m. Indian Standard Time tomorrow. There would be Professor Nutba Taj Langa, who is Professor Department of English, former Christian College, University, Pakistan. Then we have got Professor Dipendu Das, who is Dean of Smriti Kumar Chattopadhyay School of English and Foreign Language Studies and Professor, Department of English, Assam University. Then last but not the least is Dr. Richard Benkin, who is from University of Pennsylvania, United States of America. So do join us at 3 p.m. tomorrow. Thank you very much for listening to us and giving your responses and actively participating. Thank you very much. And from here in Agartala, good night to everybody. Thank you very much. Namaskar.